Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Thomas Garrett had spent 15 Septembers in the North Cascades, and he knew the difference between animal sounds and everything else. The radio crackle at 6:47 a.m. carried neither. He set his coffee down on the ranger station desk, the ceramic mug leaving a ring on the incident log he'd been reviewing, and listened to the static resolve into a woman's voice. "This is Rachel Chen checking in from Cascade Pass Trail, mile marker 7.2. Professional, calm, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who knew what they were doing in the backcountry. I need to report something unusual." Thomas reached for his Motorola handset, thumb hovering over the transmit button. Unusual could mean anything from bear activity to weather changes, but something in her inflection made him wait. "The shadows here aren't tracking right with the sun position," Rachel continued. The words came faster now, clipped at the edges. "And the ground it's breathing. I can feel it through my boots, rhythmic. Like something underneath is." Static consumed the transmission. Thomas pressed transmit. "This is Ranger Garrett at Marble Mount Station. Rachel, can you clarify your position and status?" 3 seconds of dead air. Then, "The shadows are wrong, the shadows are wrong, the shadows are..." The signal died completely. Thomas checked his watch. A scratched Timex expedition that had survived more backcountry emergencies than he cared to count. 6:51 a.m. Sunrise had been at 6:34. He pulled up the topographic map on his aging Dell desktop, tracing the Cascade Pass Trail with his finger. Mile marker 7.2 put Rachel at approximately 4,800 feet elevation, 2 miles below the pass itself, in a section of old-growth hemlock and Douglas fir that funneled down into a drainage carved by Doubtful Creek. He'd hiked it probably 300 times. The permit log showed Rachel Chen, age 28, solo hiker from Seattle with an overnight permit for Cascade Pass Campground. Experienced according to her backcountry resume, she'd logged permits for Olympic, Glacier, and Rainier over the past 4 years. Not the type to panic over shadows. Thomas lifted the handset again. "Rachel, this is Ranger Garrett. If you can hear me, stay on the trail and mark your position. I'm heading your way." Nothing. He grabbed his pack from the equipment room, running through the mental checklist that had become automatic over 15 years. First aid kit, emergency bivvy, water purification tablets, headlamp, extra batteries, Garmin GPS unit, sat phone, protein bars, space blanket, signal mirror. The Motorola radio went into his chest harness. His personal phone, a basic Nokia flip, stayed on the desk. Coverage was non-existent past the trailhead anyway. The drive to Cascade River Road took 23 minutes in his Park Service F-250, the truck rattling over potholes that winter had chewed into the pavement. Mist clung to the valley bottom, reducing visibility to maybe 40 yards. By the time Thomas reached the trailhead parking lot at 7:36 a.m., the sun had vanished behind a ceiling of gray that pressed down on the ridgeline. Rachel's vehicle was a silver Honda CR-V with Washington plates and a Backcountry Hikers Association sticker on the rear window. He placed his palm on the hood. Stone cold. She'd been on the trail since well before dawn. Thomas shouldered his pack and started up the trail at a pace just below a jog. The path climbed through dense forest, switchbacking up the valley wall in segments that gained elevation in lung-burning increments. Sword ferns crowded the trail edges, their fronds heavy with condensation. The air smelled of wet cedar and decomposing needles, that particular North Cascades cocktail of growth and decay happening simultaneously. At mile marker 3, he keyed his radio. "Marble Mount, this is Garrett. I'm on Cascade Pass Trail, heading to last known position of missing hiker Rachel Chen. Establishing search perimeter." Dispatch acknowledged. Protocol required check-ins every 30 minutes during active searches. The forest thickened as he climbed. Douglas firs stretched toward the cloud ceiling, their trunks disappearing into mist maybe 60 feet up. Between the trees, The understory had developed that claustrophobic density that happens in old-growth forests where light becomes a rationed commodity. Salal bushes formed impenetrable walls. Devil's Club lurked in the shadows, its spines ready to shred any skin that contacted it. At mile marker 5, Thomas found the first marker that didn't belong. It was carved into the bark of a massive hemlock, maybe 4 feet off the ground. Not the casual graffiti that occasionally defaced backcountry trees. This was deliberate, precise. A circle containing a cross with 3 horizontal bars of decreasing length, orthodox style. Below it, letters in an alphabet Thomas didn't recognize. The cuts were fresh, sap still weeping from the wounds. He photographed it with his Olympus Tough camera, the kind that survived drops and water exposure. The image on the preview screen looked flat, failing to capture how the carving seemed to pull at his peripheral vision, demanding attention from angles where it shouldn't be visible. Thomas keyed his radio. "Dispatch, I'm at mile marker 5. Found unusual trail marking, possible vandalism or something else. Continuing to mile marker 7.2. The trail steepened. His quadriceps began the familiar burn of sustained climbing. 15 years of this work had kept Thomas lean and functional at 42, but age had started adding minutes to a sense that used to come easier. His breathing found its rhythm. 3 steps inhale, 3 steps exhale. At mile marker 6.5, he found Rachel's first piece of equipment. The water bottle, a yellow Nalgene, sat upright on a flat rock beside the trail. Not dropped, not discarded. Placed. The cap was off, the bottle 3/4 full. Thomas picked it up carefully, examining it without disturbing potential evidence. No blood, no signs of struggle. The water inside looked clean. He poured a small amount onto his hand, sniffed it. Normal. He tasted it. Slightly metallic, like it had been treated with iodine tablets, but nothing alarming. Setting the bottle back exactly where he'd found it, Thomas continued up the trail. The mist had thickened into proper fog now, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet. Sounds became muffled, directions unreliable. His GPS showed him at 4,650 feet elevation, within a 1/4 mile of Rachel's last known position. The second carving appeared on a cedar trunk, this one larger and more elaborate. The same orthodox cross surrounded by Cyrillic-looking letters, but with additional symbols radiating outward. Crescents, stars, and something that resembled an eye weeping 3 tears. The wood around the carving had darkened as if stained. Thomas placed his hand near it, not quite touching. The bark felt cold. Not autumn morning cold, but refrigerator cold. Meat locker cold. His fingers jerked back involuntarily. "Rachel!" His voice vanished into the fog, absorbed rather than echoed. No response. The trail entered a section Thomas had always found unsettling even in daylight. The drainage narrowed here, forcing Doubtful Creek into a series of small cascades that filled the air with white noise. Hemlock and cedar grew so thick that noon looked like dusk. The forest floor consisted of nurse logs in various states of decomposition, some supporting new growth, others collapsing into black mush. Mile marker 7.2 appeared through the fog, a weathered wooden post with faded numbers. This was Rachel's last transmission point. Thomas stopped, listening. The creek provided its constant background hiss. Wind moved through the canopy, except there was no wind. He could feel no air movement on his face, but the trees were definitely moving, branches swaying in slow, synchronized waves. Rachel's backpack sat against the trail marker post, not thrown down, not torn open. Set there with care, the hip belt unbuckled, shoulder straps arranged neatly. Thomas approached it as if it might detonate. His hands felt clumsy as he opened the main compartment, expecting blood or signs of attack. Instead, he found the organized contents of an experienced hiker. Food bags properly sealed in bear-proof containers, spare clothing in dry bags, a first aid kit, maps in a waterproof case, tent and sleeping bag compressed in their stuff sacks. Her phone was there, an iPhone 4, which would have been relatively new in September 2011. He pressed the power button. Dead battery. What wasn't there? Her identification, her wallet, any personal items. Thomas's radio crackled. Garrett, this is Marblemount. Status update. I've located the missing hiker's equipment at mile marker 7.2, Thomas said, his voice sounding strange even to himself. Pack and supplies present and organized. No sign of the hiker, no signs of struggle or animal activity. Something else is movement in his peripheral vision. Thomas spun toward it. A woman stood approximately 30 feet down the trail, partially obscured by fog and trees. She wore hiking clothes, dark pants, a blue jacket. Rachel's permit photo had shown a woman with straight black hair pulled into a ponytail. This woman's hair hung loose around her face. Rachel? Rachel Chen? She didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, facing him, but somehow not seeing him. Her posture was wrong, knees locked straight, arms hanging at odd angles like a marionette whose strings had gone slack. Thomas took 3 steps toward her. Rachel, I'm Ranger Thomas Garrett. I'm here to help you. Are you injured? The woman's head tilted sideways, the movement too smooth, lacking the mechanical resistance of human neck muscles. In the fog, Thomas couldn't make out her face clearly, just the pale oval of skin surrounded by dark hair. Rachel, can you hear me? She took a step backward, then another, not turning around, just stepping backward, her feet finding purchase without her looking where she was going. Wait. Stop. Thomas broke into a run. The woman moved faster, still backward, still facing him, her body gliding over obstacles that should have tripped her. Thomas crashed through undergrowth, his pack catching on branches, his boots skidding on wet moss. She vanished into the fog. Thomas stopped where he'd last seen her, breathing hard. The ground here was soft, covered in needles and decomposing leaves. Her footprints should have been obvious. There were no footprints. He stood there for 30 seconds, listening to his own breathing and the creak and the windless movement of trees. His left hand trembled slightly. Adrenaline, he told himself. Just adrenaline from the chase. The radio crackled again. Garrett, we didn't copy your last transmission. Please repeat. Thomas raised the handset, trying to organize his thoughts into something that wouldn't sound insane. I'm at mile marker 7.2. I've located the missing hiker's equipment, but not the hiker. I thought I saw her, but negative contact. Requesting backup for expanded search. Copy that. We're dispatching Ranger Mackenzie from Stehekin Station. ETA 2 hours. 2 hours. It would be past 11 a.m. by then, assuming Mackenzie made good time. Thomas looked at Rachel's pack, then at the trail disappearing into fog in both directions. He keyed the radio again. Dispatch, I'm going to continue up toward the pass. If she's disoriented or hypothermic, she might have kept moving uphill. Negative, Garrett, wait for backup, that's protocol. Thomas knew the protocol. He'd written parts of it, but he also knew that hypothermic hikers did irrational things, and if Rachel was injured and moving, every minute decreased her chances. Copy, he said, which wasn't agreement. He marked Rachel's pack location with bright orange flagging tape, then continued up the trail. The path steepened into a series of aggressive switchbacks that would bring him above tree line in another mile. His legs were burning now, 15 years of conditioning suddenly feeling inadequate. The third carving appeared on a twisted mountain hemlock, this one so elaborate it must have taken hours. The Orthodox cross dominated the center, but around it someone had carved an entire scene. Figures with elongated limbs surrounding what might have been a prone body. The letters were different here. Thomas recognized the alphabet now from a deployment to Kosovo years ago, before he'd become a ranger. Romanian. This was Romanian, and he could read one word, repeated 3 times around the circle. Strigoi. Thomas had heard the term. Folk tales from Eastern Europe. Vampire legends older than Dracula. His ex-wife Elena had been first-generation Romanian-American, and her grandmother had told stories that made young Elena sleep with lights on. The Strigoi were the restless dead, different from the Hollywood vampires. They drained life force rather than blood, could possess the living, took various shapes. Elena's grandmother had insisted they were real, that her own village had dealt with one in the 1940s. He dismissed it as old country superstition. Standing here in the fog at nearly 5,000 feet, looking at a carving that radiated wrongness, he felt his certainty cracking. His GPS unit beeped. Low battery, which was impossible. He'd charged it last night. The screen flickered, coordinates jumping randomly. 48.4756 degree on became 48.4831 degree on became 47.9944 degree on. The elevation reading fluctuated between 4,200 feet and 9,600 feet. Thomas tapped it against his palm. The screen went black. The fog had thickened further. He could barely see 10 feet now. The trail itself was visible only by the narrow strip of exposed dirt between the encroaching vegetation. He pulled out his compass. Analog, reliable, immune to battery failure. The needle spun in slow circles, never settling. Something moved in the trees to his left. Not Rachel this time. Something larger, displacing fog, moving through undergrowth without snapping branches or rustling leaves. Thomas unclipped the canister of bear spray from his belt, thumbing off the safety. The movement stopped. Silence descended. Absolute silence. Even the creek had gone quiet. Then breathing. Deep, wet, rattling breathing that came from everywhere and nowhere. "Who's there?" Thomas's voice cracked embarrassingly on the second word. The breathing continued, each inhalation lasting 5 or 6 seconds, each exhalation accompanied by a sound like fluid draining through a clogged pipe. The air smelled wrong suddenly. Copper and rot and something else, something that made Thomas's hindbrain scream predator. A shape emerged from the fog. Tall, maybe 7 feet. Its outline wrong in ways Thomas's mind refused to process. It had limbs. He thought it had limbs, but they bent at angles that violated anatomy. Where its head should be, there was only a mass of darkness that seemed to absorb light. The shape moved closer. Thomas's finger tightened on the bear spray trigger. "Morti nengropats," a voice said. Rachel's voice coming from the shape or behind it or through it. "Suflet furat, trup pustiu." Thomas didn't speak Romanian, but he remembered fragments from Elena's grandmother. Morty meant dead. Suflet was soul. The words sounded wrong in Rachel's voice, the intonation off, like someone speaking phonetically without understanding. The shape took another step forward. Thomas stumbled backward, his heel catching on a root. He went down hard, his pack cushioning the fall but trapping him. The bear spray can flew from his hand, disappeared into fog and undergrowth. The shape loomed over him. This close, Thomas could see it was wearing clothes. Rachel's blue jacket, her dark pants, but they hung on a frame that was too long, too angular. The thing inside them was not human-shaped. A face emerged from the darkness where the head should be. Rachel's face, but stretched, the skin pulled tight over bones that had rearranged themselves into something predatory. Her mouth opened impossibly wide. Inside, Thomas saw not teeth, but something that resembled thorns, black and glistening. "View more," Rachel's voice said. "Living dead. I am Inviat. I am risen." Her hand, elongated, fingers like twigs, reached toward Thomas's face. Where it passed through the fog, the moisture froze into tiny crystals that fell like snow. Thomas rolled sideways, scrambling to his feet, and ran. He crashed through undergrowth with no regard for the trail, driven by pure panic, the kind of terror that erased 15 years of training and wilderness experience. Branches whipped his face. His pack caught on something and he shrugged out of it without stopping, letting it fall. Behind him came that wet, rattling breathing, keeping pace effortlessly. His foot hit something, a log, a rock, and suddenly he was falling, tumbling down a steep slope he hadn't seen in the fog. His body hit trees, rocks, earth, each impact driving the air from his lungs. The world became a chaos of gray and green and pain. He stopped in a tangle of vine maple, 30 or 40 feet below the trail. His left arm felt wrong, bent in a way that made his stomach lurch. His radio was gone, torn from his chest harness. Blood ran from a gash above his right eye, warm and slick. Thomas lay there, trying to breathe, trying to understand what he'd just seen. Above him on the slope, the breathing had stopped. The fog moved in patterns that might have been wind, or might have been something else. He needed to move. Getting up required using his injured arm, which produced a pain so vivid he nearly vomited. Broken. Definitely broken. He fumbled in his pockets with his right hand, found the small bottle of ibuprofen he always carried. Dry swallowed 4 tablets. The slope above remained empty, silent. Thomas oriented himself using the incline. Downhill would eventually lead to Doubtful Creek, which paralleled the trail. He could follow the creek down to the trailhead if necessary. His truck keys were still in his pocket. Moving through the undergrowth was slow agony. Every step jarred his broken arm, sending fresh waves of pain through his shoulder. The fog thinned slightly as he descended, or maybe his eyes were adjusting. He could see perhaps 15 feet now. That's when he found the cabin. It shouldn't have existed. Thomas knew every structure in this section of the park, which was to say, there weren't any. Backcountry camping only. No permanent buildings except for ranger stations at valley bottoms, but here it was. A small log structure, maybe 12 feet square, with a single window and a door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. The logs were weathered silver gray, the chinking between them long since fallen away. Thomas approached it carefully, his pain temporarily forgotten. The cabin looked old, very old, pre-park old, possibly dating to the early 1900s when prospectors and trappers still worked these mountains. The door was ajar. Through the gap, he could see darkness. Every instinct told him to keep moving, get to the creek, get out of the mountains. But ranger training was hard to override. Check all structures, look for evidence, document everything. And something about the cabin pulled at him, the same way the carvings had pulled at his peripheral vision. He pushed the door open with his boot. It swung inward with a shriek of rusted hinges. The interior was a single room, maybe 10 by 12 feet. Enough light filtered through the window and door gap to reveal basic contents. A crude bed frame of lashed saplings, a table made from split logs, a fireplace built into the back wall. Everything was covered in years of dust and forest debris. On the table sat a leather-bound book. Thomas stepped inside. The air smelled of mildew and old smoke and something else, something organic that had died slowly. The floorboards creaked under his weight, rotten in places, revealing the dirt underneath. The book looked impossibly preserved given the cabin's condition. Its leather cover showed wear but no real decay. No title or markings on the outside. Thomas opened it with his good hand. The pages were yellowed parchment, covered in handwritten text. Romanian mostly, with sections in what might have been Latin. Crude drawings illustrated some pages, circles and crosses and symbolic representations of human figures, some standing, many prone. One image showed a body with a stake through its chest. Another showed fire consuming what looked like bones. At the top of the first page, someone had written in English, Journal of Andrei Popescu, Spring, 1923. Thomas flipped through pages, looking for more English. He found a passage dated May 17, 1923. They do not understand what I have brought with me. The villagers drove me out, said I carried the curse, said my brother had become Strigoi, and I had failed to cleanse him properly, but I did everything the old ways demanded. I drove the stake through his heart, I removed the head, I burned what remained. Yet still he rose on the third night, his form broken but animated, his eyes empty but seeing. He spoke with voices of the dead, dozens of voices, and he reached for me with hands that were no longer hands. I fled. God forgive me, I fled. I came to America to escape him, but I fear I brought the curse with me. The land here is too new, too wild. There is no church, no priest, no blessed ground. If I become as my brother became... The next several pages were dense Romanian text. Thomas skipped ahead, found another English passage, this one dated August 3rd, 1923. It is happening. I feel the change in my bones and my blood. The transformation takes 3 days, the old stories say. First day, the living death. The body still moves, but the soul begins to separate. Second day, the hunger begins, though not for food. The Strigoi craves life itself, seeks to drain it from the living to fill the emptiness where the soul once was. Third day, the complete transformation. The body reshapes itself for hunting, bones lengthening, joints bending in new ways, the mouth forming thorns instead of teeth. By the third day, the human form is merely a shell, a costume the Strigoi wears to lure prey. I have perhaps a day remaining. I have prepared the cabin as best I can, written these instructions in both tongues. If someone finds this, they must know. The Strigoi can be stopped, but only with proper ritual. Not stakes, not fire. These are peasant solutions for peasant corpses. For a true Strigoi, one must use the old ways, the ways that predate Christianity. The blood of the living must be freely given, painted in the pattern of binding around the Strigoi's resting place. The words of unbinding must be spoken. And then, only then, can fire truly consume what should not walk. The handwriting on subsequent pages deteriorated, becoming shaky, then nearly illegible. The final English passage, dated August 5, 1923, consisted of a single line. I am inviat, I am risen. God forgive what I have become. Thomas stared at the page, his injured arm forgotten. August 5, 1923, nearly 90 years ago. If Andrei Popescu had transformed in this cabin, what had happened to him? Had he left, wandered the mountains, or had something else? The breathing started again outside the cabin. Thomas spun toward the door. Through the gap he could see fog moving in patterns that weren't wind-driven. The breathing came closer, that wet, rattling sound that made his skin feel too tight. He looked frantically around the cabin. No back door, no windows large enough to escape through. The fireplace, the chimney, he could try to. The door slammed shut. Not blown by wind. Slammed by something that wanted him trapped inside. Total darkness. Thomas fumbled for his headlamp, then remembered it had been in his pack, which he'd dropped during his fall. His hand found the small flashlight on his belt, a backup light, running on a single AA battery. He clicked it on. The weak beam revealed the cabin interior, now deeply sinister in the darkness. Shadows moved independently of the light. Something scratched at the door. Not animal scratching, rhythmic, deliberate, like fingernails against wood in a pattern. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Thomas backed toward the fireplace, his light swinging wildly. The book on the table seemed to glow slightly in his peripheral vision. The blood of the living must be freely given, painted in the pattern of binding. He opened the book again, flipping through pages with shaking hands. Found the diagram, an orthodox cross surrounded by a circle, with specific symbols at the cardinal points. The same pattern carved on the trees. The scratching stopped. Silence. Then the door began to open slowly, the rusted hinges shrieking. Rachel stood in the doorway. Or what had been Rachel. The transformation was more complete now. Her form had elongated further, her spine curving forward at an impossible angle, her arms hanging past her knees. Her face was barely human anymore. The skin stretched so tight that the skull beneath showed through. Her mouth hung open, revealing the forest of thorns where teeth should be. "View mort," she said. "I have been waiting. 90 years of waiting. 90 years of hunger." Thomas's mind raced. 90 years. Andrei Popescu had transformed in August 1923. This thing wearing Rachel's skin had been here, dormant or hunting or waiting, for nearly a century. Where is Rachel? Thomas forced the words out. What did you do to her? The thing that wasn't Rachel tilted its head. She invited me in, touched the markings on the trees, read the words aloud. Did you know she spoke Romanian? Her grandfather from Bucharest. She thought the carvings were historical curiosities. She did not know they were warnings. She did not know they were also invitations. I needed a new form. The old one had worn thin. It stepped into the cabin. In the flashlight beam, Thomas could see how the clothing hung on a frame that was no longer human-shaped. Where the fabric pulled tight, he could see what might have been Rachel's skin, stretched over bones that had been broken and reset into new configurations. The ranger before you 15 years ago, it continued in Rachel's voice. He nearly discovered the truth, but I was weak then, newly woken. I could only watch from distance, could only leave marks and signs. You saw him, I think, in your records. Timothy Morrison. He left the park suddenly. Psychological distress, the report said. He had seen too much. Thomas remembered Morrison vaguely. The ranger he'd replaced. A man in his 50s who'd transferred out abruptly in early 1997. The official reason had been family issues, but there had been whispers. I am stronger now, it said. Rachel was young, healthy. Her form will last longer than the others, and after you, I will have choices. 2 bodies to work with. I can learn new patterns. It took another step forward. Thomas backed against the fireplace, trapped. The blood of the living must be freely given. He looked down at his broken arm, at the gash on his forehead still slowly bleeding. Blood of the living, freely given. The ritual, Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. Andre wrote about a ritual, a way to stop the Strigoi. The thing laughed. Rachel's laugh distorted into something like branches breaking. Andre was a fool. The ritual requires the blood be given freely, painted in the pattern of binding. But to give freely means to consent. And who would consent to binding themselves to their own death? The ritual was his last desperate hope. It failed him. It will fail you. Thomas looked at his blood dripping from his forehead, spattering on the dusty floorboards. Freely given. Consent. A desperate idea formed, so insane it might work. I'll make you a deal, he said. The thing stopped. Strigoi do not make deals. You just told me you need bodies. You said you can choose now. Wouldn't you prefer a healthy body over a broken one? Thomas held up his twisted arm. My arm's broken. I'm bleeding. I'm damaged goods. But if you let me go, I'll send people up here. Hikers. Rangers. Healthy people who don't know what's waiting. It studied him with eyes that were Rachel's but filled with something ancient and hungry. You would betray others to save yourself? I'm a realist. I can't fight you, can't escape, but I can be useful to you alive. The thing moved closer. Thomas could smell it now. Decay masked by Rachel's deodorant and shampoo, rot underneath perfume. It reached out with a hand that had too many joints, touched his injured arm, pain exploded white and hot. I can taste your fear, it said. Your desperation, your lies. You would not betray others. You are the type who follows protocol, who helps the lost, who risks himself for strangers. This is why you will fail. This is why I will take your form and use it to lure others. Its hand moved to Thomas's face, fingers cold as frozen meat. Where it touched, Thomas felt numbness spreading, his own life force draining away. His vision began to tunnel. With his last conscious thought, Thomas jerked his head forward and bit down on the thing's finger. Hard. Blood, his blood or Rachel's blood or something else entirely, filled his mouth. He spat it out, aiming for the floor, painting a rough cross in the dust with his own saliva and the blood mixture. I give it freely, he gasped. I consent. I bind myself to this place, to this pattern, to this death. I give it freely. The thing shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and jerked back. Where Thomas's blood had hit the floor, it began to glow with a faint greenish light. The glow spread, tracing patterns in the dust, following paths only it understood. The orthodox cross formed, then the circle surrounding it, then symbols at the cardinal points. No, the thing hissed. You do not understand what you have done. The binding does not bind me. It binds you. You cannot leave. Your death will feed this place. Your soul will become as mine, trapped between life and death, hungry for eternity. The green glow reached the cabin walls. Where it touched wood, the ancient logs began to smoke, not burning, transforming. The rot reversed itself, the decay unwound. The cabin was restoring itself, becoming what it had been in 1923. Thomas felt it too. The pain in his arm intensified, then vanished. Not healed, changed. He looked down and saw his broken bones straightening inside his flesh, saw the skin sealing over his forehead wound. But underneath the healing, he felt something else. Emptiness. A hollowness spreading through his chest where his heart beat. "Now you understand," the thing said. "We are both bound, both strigoi, both hungry. We will hunt together, or we will starve together. You thought you were sacrificing yourself. Instead, you have become me." The transformation was happening. Thomas could feel his bones beginning to shift, his joints loosening, his body preparing to reshape itself for hunting. The first day, the living death Andre had written. The body still moves, but the soul begins to separate. He had perhaps 2 more days before he became completely what the thing in Rachel's skin already was. There's fire. Thomas Whitaker had spent 11 years with the National Park Service analyzing patterns that others overlooked. While younger rangers chased adrenaline through search and rescue operations, he preferred the quiet satisfaction of connecting dots on incident reports, tracing wildlife migration routes, and maintaining meticulous records of trail conditions. His colleagues at Canyon de Chelly National Monument sometimes joked that he loved spreadsheets more than sunsets, and Thomas never bothered to correct them. The truth was simpler. He trusted data because data didn't lie. The October morning that Christopher Hayes failed to return from the White House Ruins Trail, Thomas was reviewing maintenance logs in the small office he shared with 3 other rangers. The initial report came through dispatch at 11:47 a.m., a wife calling from Flagstaff, voice tight with the particular anxiety that preceded genuine panic. Her husband had planned a solo day hike, she explained. He'd texted her at 8:15 a.m. from the trailhead. Nothing since. Christopher was experienced, she emphasized. He'd hiked all over the Southwest. He carried a Garmin GPS, a first aid kit, 3 liters of water. He knew to stay on marked trails. Thomas listened to the recording twice, his pen moving across a yellow legal pad in neat economical strokes. The White House Ruins Trail was 2.5 miles round trip, descending 600 feet from the canyon rim to the valley floor. Most hikers completed it in 2 to 3 hours. Christopher had now been gone nearly 4 hours past a reasonable timeline. The variables began arranging themselves in Thomas's mind like chess pieces. Ambient temperature 68 degrees. Visibility excellent. No weather warnings. No recent rockfall reports on that section. Subject was male, 34, fit, experienced. Equipment adequate. Knowledge base solid. Something was missing from the equation. By 1:30 p.m., Thomas was hiking down into Canyon de Chelly with Ranger Julie Tsosi, their boots kicking up fine red dust that settled on their dark green uniforms. Julie was Navajo, born in Chinle and raised with stories that Thomas cataloged mentally as cultural folklore. Interesting data points about belief systems, nothing more. She moved down the switchbacks with the efficiency of someone who'd walked these trails since childhood, while Thomas paused every few minutes to scan the canyon walls through his binoculars, looking for anomalies. The October sun carved sharp shadows across the sandstone cliffs, turning the ancient rock into a study of burnt orange and deep crimson. Far below, the cottonwood trees along the wash had begun their autumn transformation, leaves flickering yellow against the red earth. Thomas noted the beauty in an abstract way, the same way he noted the GPS coordinates they'd been given for Christopher's last known location, 36.121 de Guanyin, 109.4782 de Gradoi, approximately 0.8 miles down the trail. His wife said he wanted to photograph Spider Rock at dawn, Julie said, adjusting the radio on her belt. That's why he started early. Thomas nodded, mentally calculating. Spider Rock stood over 800 feet tall, a sandstone spire sacred to the Navajo. Christopher would have needed to be near the White House Ruins overlook for the best view. That matched the coordinates. Did she mention if he'd been here before? 3 times. Knew the area. Julie's voice carried something Thomas couldn't quite categorize. Not worry exactly, but a wariness that seemed disproportionate to the situation. They'd done dozens of searches together. Lost hikers were usually found within hours, embarrassed and dehydrated but fine. They found Christopher's backpack at 2:47 p.m. It sat beside the trail, 20 feet from the White House ruins overlook, positioned so carefully it might have been staged. The pack leaned against a rock, straps neatly coiled, zippers closed. Thomas crouched beside it, pulling latex gloves from his pocket, old habit from his brief stint in law enforcement before joining the NPS. He photographed the pack from multiple angles before touching it, then opened it methodically. 3 water bottles, each full. First aid kit, unused. Garmin GPS unit, battery at 73%. Thomas powered it on, scrolling through the route history. Christopher had indeed reached this spot at 7:52 a.m., spent 43 minutes here, then the GPS recorded nothing more. Phone was in the pack too, turned off. Wallet, keys, energy bars, windbreaker, sunscreen, everything a prepared hiker should have. Everything except the hiker. Thomas! Julie's voice had changed. She stood 10 feet away, staring at the ground near the canyon's edge. He joined her, following her gaze to the dirt. Footprints size 11 or 12 matched the tread pattern of the hiking boots they'd found in Christopher's pack description. The tracks led from the backpack toward the overlook, clear and deep. Then they stopped. Not faded or blown away by wind, stopped. As if Christopher Hayes had simply stepped off the earth. Thomas spent the next hour documenting everything. He photographed the prints, measured their depth, noted their orientation. He searched for scuff marks, disturbance patterns, any evidence of a struggle or fall. The cliff edge showed no signs of recent disturbance. He lay on his stomach and looked over, scanning the talus slope 600 feet below. No body, no equipment, no signs of impact. Julie stood back, speaking quietly into her radio, coordinating additional resources. When Thomas finally stood, brushing red dust from his uniform, he found her watching him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. "We should get more people down here," he said. "Expand the search radius. He might have wandered off trail, gotten disoriented." "Thomas." She cut him off gently. "Did you look at the other tracks?" "What other tracks?" She pointed. 20 feet past Christopher's footprints, heading back up the trail toward the rim, were more impressions in the dust. Thomas approached them, his analytical mind already noting details. Similar size, similar pattern. But the depth was wrong. Too shallow, as if whatever made them weighed almost nothing. And the spacing was off. The stride length was 7 feet, 8 feet between prints. Impossible for a human walking. He took more photographs, pulling a tape measure from his pack. The impressions were clear despite their shallowness. As he documented the third print, something made him look closer. There, pressed into the dust inside the boot impression, was something else. Something that made his throat constrict, despite his determination to remain analytical. 4 toes. No, not toes, claws, each as long as his thumb, pressed deep while the boot print around them barely dented the earth. "We need to call this in," Julie said. Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here, now." Thomas wanted to ask why, wanted to apply logic to what he was seeing, but another part of his brain, the part that existed before civilization, before analysis, before reason, was screaming at him to listen to her. They hiked back up the trail in 73 minutes, moving faster than was strictly safe on the steep switchbacks. Thomas kept looking behind them, unable to articulate what he was watching for. The canyon walls seemed to lean in as the shadows lengthened, and twice he heard sounds that his mind tried to classify as wind or birds or falling rocks. But that landed in his ears as something else, entirely. That night, in the small apartment he rented in Chinley, Thomas spread his photographs across the kitchen table and tried to construct a rational explanation. Christopher Hayes had walked to the overlook. Something had happened there. The tracks leading away were either an unrelated animal that had crossed the area later or what? His mind refused to complete the thought. He opened his laptop, typing "Canyon de Chelly missing hikers" into the search bar. The results were typical. A handful of incidents over the years, all resolved. Tourist who'd wandered off drunk, elderly man with dementia. Nothing like this. He refined his search. Canyon de Chelly, disappearances unexplained. The results changed. A blog post from 2009 written by a former ranger. 3 paragraphs in, Thomas stopped breathing normally. The ranger described finding a hiker's belongings near Spider Rock. Tracks that led nowhere, and something else. Reports from Navajo workers refusing to enter certain areas of the canyon after sunset. Stories about Yinald Lushi. Thomas had heard Julie use that term before, always in Navajo, usually when she thought he wasn't listening. He'd never asked what it meant because categorizing other people's folklore felt intrusive. Now he typed it into Google, and the Wikipedia entry loaded with a single word in English: skinwalker. He read for 2 hours, his coffee growing cold. The Navajo belief described witches who wore the pelts of animals, who could transform, who moved at impossible speeds, who could mimic human voices, who left tracks that changed mid-stride from human to animal and back again. It was fascinating from an anthropological perspective, the universality of shapeshifter myths across cultures, the psychological need to explain the unexplainable through supernatural means. But Thomas wasn't thinking about anthropology as he stared at the photograph of those elongated prints with their impossible claw marks. He was thinking about the scraping sound he'd heard on the trail, like something heavy being dragged through brush. He was thinking about the way Julie's face had drained of color. He was thinking about Christopher Hayes, experienced hiker, who'd vanished mid-step with all his gear left behind. His phone rang at 11:42 p.m., Julie's name on the screen. "Don't go back down there tomorrow," she said without preamble. "Please. We have a missing person. I have to. The search team is coming from Flagstaff. SR with dogs, helicopter support. Let them handle it." Thomas rubbed his eyes. "Julie, what's going on? What do you think happened to him?" The silence on the line stretched long enough that he thought she'd hung up. Then, "My grandmother won't say the name out loud. She says speaking of them draws their attention. But she told me that when she was young, a trader went missing near Spider Rock. They found his truck, his wallet, everything. 3 weeks later, someone saw him walking on Highway 191 at 3 a.m., walked right up to a car. The driver said his eyes were wrong, reflected like an animal's. When they tried to talk to him, he ran, but not like a person runs. He went over a 6-foot fence without touching it and disappeared into the desert. They never found him again." "That's a story, Julie. Not data. You saw the tracks." Thomas didn't answer because she was right. He had seen the tracks, and some part of his brain that he'd spent his entire adult life suppressing knew they were wrong in a way that transcended normal wrongness. "Just stay out of the canyon tomorrow," Julie said. "Please." She hung up before he could respond. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table, reviewing his photographs, trying to find the logical explanation that must exist. At 4:17 a.m., his phone buzzed with an email from dispatch. SAR team had arrived. Helicopter sweep scheduled for dawn. Ground search commencing at first light. All available rangers to report to the command post by 6 a.m. He was the first to arrive, pulling into the White House Ruins trailhead parking lot at 5:48 a.m. The SAR command vehicle sat near the bathrooms, lights on, radio chatter spilling into the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas approached, showing his credentials to the coordinator, a man named Mike Chen who'd worked search and rescue in Utah for 15 years. "Your ranger reported unusual tracks at the scene," Mike said, spreading a topographic map across the vehicle's hood. "Can you show me exactly where?" Thomas marked the locations, explaining the layout, the missing man's equipment, the footprints that terminated mid-stride. Mike listened without interrupting, his expression neutral and professional. When Thomas finished, Mike nodded slowly. "We'll start with a standard grid search. If he wandered off disoriented, dogs should pick up the scent. Helicopters got FLIR. We'll find him." Thomas wanted to believe him. Mike's confidence was built on hundreds of successful searches, on training and experience and equipment that could locate a heat signature from 1,000 feet up. It was the kind of confidence Thomas understood, respected, relied upon. But Mike hadn't seen the tracks. The sun rose over Canyon de Chelly at 6:43 a.m., painting the sandstone cliffs in shades of gold and rust. The SAR team deployed with military efficiency, 3 dog teams, a dozen ground searchers, the helicopter already sweeping the canyon from above. Thomas accompanied Mike's group, hiking down the same trail he'd descended yesterday, his boots finding the same dusty switchbacks. In daylight, with a dozen people moving purposefully through the landscape, the canyon felt different, safer. The shadows that had seemed menacing yesterday were just shadows. The strange sounds were just wind through juniper branches, ravens calling from the cliffs. Thomas felt his analytical mind reasserting itself, pushing back against the unease that had plagued him all night. They reached the overlook at 8:15 a.m. Christopher's backpack was gone. Evidence collection, Mike explained. But the footprints remained, protected overnight by crime scene tape that Julie must have placed. The dog handlers approached, letting their German shepherd sniff the ground where Christopher's tracks ended. Thomas watched the dogs work. They were trained to detect human scent, to follow trails hours or days old. Both animals sniffed the final footprints, then raised their heads, whining. One paced in a circle, clearly agitated. The other backed away from the overlook, ears flat, hackles raised. "That's weird," one of the handlers muttered, trying to guide his dog back to the scent. The animal refused, pulling against the lead. Thomas looked past them to the elongated tracks with their claw marks. In full daylight, they looked even more impossible, clearly boot prints in shape, but stretched and distorted like taffy pulled too far. The crime scene tape around them fluttered in the morning breeze. Mike crouched beside the strange tracks, examining them without touching. "Never seen anything like this. Could be hoax, someone trying to create a mystery." "Why?" Thomas asked. "Christopher Hayes is actually missing." "Yeah." Mike stood, brushing dust from his knees. "Yeah, that's the problem with that theory, isn't it?" The helicopter circled overhead, the downdraft sending up swirls of red dust. Thomas's radio crackled with reports from other search teams. Nothing. 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 The canyon was only so large. A man couldn't simply vanish. But Thomas was beginning to understand that "couldn't" was a word without meaning here. They searched until 6 p.m., covering every accessible area within a 5-mile radius. The helicopter's FLIR had detected nothing. The dogs had found no scent trail. It was as if Christopher Hayes had been lifted from the earth by invisible hands, leaving only his belongings in those impossible tracks. As the SAR team packed up their equipment in the fading light, Mike approached Thomas with his radio in hand. "Dispatch got a call 30 minutes ago. Gas station in Mexican Water about 40 miles north. Clerk reported a man matching Christopher's description trying to buy cigarettes. Couldn't complete the transaction, kept dropping the money. Clerk said he seemed wrong. Left without the cigarettes, walked toward the highway." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Did they get a vehicle description? Wasn't in a vehicle, was on foot. Clerk said she tried to talk to him, ask if he needed help, but when he turned to look at her, his eyes... Mike paused, checking his notes. His eyes caught the light wrong, like a coyote's. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Around them, SR personnel loaded gear into vehicles, their voices low and tired. The canyon had swallowed another day, given back nothing. "That's probably not him," Mike finally said, but his voice carried no conviction. Thomas drove back to Chinle as darkness settled over the high desert, his mind trying to process what he knew, what he'd seen, what he refused to believe. The logical explanation was that Christopher had experienced some kind of medical emergency, a stroke, a seizure, and wandered off confused. He was out there somewhere, injured, disoriented. The tracks were a coincidence, an animal that had crossed the area. The gas station report was mistaken identity, but the numbers didn't support that hypothesis. The timeline was wrong. The distances were wrong. Everything was wrong. His phone rang as he pulled into his apartment complex. Julie's voice was tight. "Are you home?" "Just got here. Why?" "Lock your doors. Don't go outside tonight. I'm serious, Thomas." "What happened?" "Mrs. Nakaidinai. She lives 2 blocks from you. She called me 20 minutes ago. Someone was outside her house looking in the windows. She said at first she thought it was her son, but then she realized her son was sitting right next to her. This thing was tall, maybe 7 feet, wearing what looked like loose skin over its body. She screamed and it ran. But Thomas, it ran on all fours, and she said it moved like water, like it was barely touching the ground. Thomas's hands had gone numb on the steering wheel. Did she call the police? They're looking now. But Thomas, this has happened before. Sightings after someone disappears in the canyon. My grandmother says it's because they're looking for someone they need. She stopped abruptly. Need what? I don't want to say it. I don't want to explain it. Just stay inside, please. After she hung up, Thomas sat in his truck for 10 minutes, staring at his apartment building. The security light over his door cast a weak yellow glow, creating more shadows than it eliminated. Every dark space between buildings seemed deeper than it should be. The cottonwood tree near his window moved in the breeze, branches scraping against the siding with a sound like fingernails on wood. He finally forced himself to move, walking quickly from his truck to his door, key ready, not looking at the shadows. Inside, he locked the deadbolt and the chain, then went through his apartment checking every window, every door, everything secure. He closed all the blinds, even though part of him insisted this was ridiculous, that he was a trained park ranger letting folklore override his rational mind. At 11:34 p.m., something tapped on his bedroom window. Thomas froze, lying in bed with his laptop open, still reviewing search data. The sound came again, tap, 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 deliberate and rhythmic. Not a branch, not wind, knuckles on glass. His window was on the second floor. He should look. He should open the blinds and prove to himself it was nothing, just a rational explanation waiting to be discovered. But his body wouldn't move. Every muscle had locked, some ancient survival instinct overriding conscious thought. The tapping stopped. Thomas waited in the darkness, his laptop screen the only light, casting blue shadows across his bedroom. Outside, he heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving across the roof over his head. The building had a flat roof, accessible only by ladder. No one should be up there. The footsteps stopped directly above his bed. Then he heard it, a voice muffled by the ceiling but clear enough to understand. His own voice. Thomas. Come outside, Thomas. I need help. His vocal patterns, his inflection, his slight tendency to clip the S sound at the end of words. Someone was using his voice to call his name. Thomas, please. I'm hurt. I fell and I need help. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands, dialing 911. The operator answered and Thomas whispered, actually whispered as if raising his voice might alert the thing on his roof. Someone's on my roof. Second floor, 447 Park Avenue, apartment 2B. I can hear them walking around. Are you in immediate danger, sir? The footsteps moved toward the edge of the building. Thomas heard a soft thump as something landed on the ground outside, then silence. I don't know, he said honestly. I don't know what it is. Police arrived 14 minutes later. Thomas watched from his window as 2 officers searched the area with flashlights, examining the ground, checking between buildings. One of them climbed the external ladder to the roof, spending several minutes up there before descending. The officer who knocked on his door was young, professional. Sir, we checked the roof and the perimeter. No signs of anyone. There are some marks in the dust on the roof. Could be shoe prints, but they're smudged. Could also be from maintenance workers. Did you see any footprints on the ground, leading away? Some disturbances in the dirt, but nothing definitive. The officer paused. Have you been under unusual stress lately, sir? Working long hours? Thomas recognized the subtext. They thought he'd imagined it. There's a missing person case. Hiker vanished in Canyon de Chelly yesterday. Yeah, I heard about that. SAR was all over it today, right? The officer's expression softened. Look, those cases are tough. They mess with your head. You start seeing things that aren't there. My advice? Get some sleep. If you hear anything else, call us back. After they left, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with every light in his apartment blazing, his service weapon, a Glock 22 he'd qualified with but rarely carried, sitting beside his laptop. He pulled up every file he could find about Canyon de Chelly disappearances, incidents, unusual reports. The data was sparse but consistent. Over the last 60 years, 17 people had vanished in or around the monument. Most were eventually found or explained. 4 remained unresolved. He cross-referenced the unresolved cases with Navajo folklore documentation, academic papers about Yinaldlushi beliefs, and historical accounts from the region. The pattern was there if you looked for it, subtle but persistent. Disappearances clustered around specific times: autumn, late spring, around specific locations: Spider Rock, certain sections of the canyon where ancient ruins crumbled into red earth. And the aftermath reports, when they existed, all included similar elements: sightings of figures that moved wrong, eyes that reflected light at night, sounds that mimicked human voices. Thomas had built his entire career on trusting data over instinct, but the data was telling him something his rational mind couldn't accept. Something was hunting in Canyon de Chelly, something that wore Christopher Hayes like a suit of clothes and walked around at night looking for others. At 4:47 a.m., his phone rang. Mike Chen from SAR. "Thomas? Sorry to wake you, but we've got a development. Hiker called in from the sliding house overlook. Says there's someone down in the canyon near the ruins. Person isn't moving, just standing there. Been there for over an hour. We're mobilizing a team." Thomas was in his truck 5 minutes later, driving through the darkness toward the monument. The SAR command vehicle was already at the overlook when he arrived, along with 2 NPS vehicles and an ambulance. Dawn was still an hour away, and the canyon below was a vast pit of shadow. Mike handed him binoculars. "Southwest side, about 400 yards. You'll need night vision." Thomas switched on the binoculars' night vision mode, scanning the canyon floor. The ancient ruins appeared as geometric shapes against the natural chaos of rock and vegetation. Then he found it, a figure standing motionless near a collapsed wall. Even through night vision, even from 600 feet away, Thomas could see it wasn't right. The proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, limbs slightly too long. It stood perfectly still, facing up toward the rim where they stood. "We've been watching it for 40 minutes, Mike said quietly. "Hasn't moved, hasn't reacted to our lights or our voices when we tried calling down." "That's not Christopher Hayes," Thomas said. "How do you know?" "Because Christopher Hayes is 5'10" and weighs 170 pounds. That thing is 7 feet tall." As if it hurt him, impossible across that distance, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It flowed, like oil poured across the ground, moving with a boneless fluidity that made Thomas's stomach clench. In seconds, it had crossed 200 yards of rough terrain. Then it simply vanished into the deeper shadows near the canyon wall. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. "What was that?" The dogs arrived at 6:30 a.m. as pale light began to seep into the canyon. Thomas watched the handlers take 3 different German shepherds down into the canyon, each animal trained to track human scent. All 3 reached the ruins where the figure had stood, then went insane. One bit its handler. Another ran back up the trail, abandoning the search entirely. The third sat down and howled, not barked, howled like a wolf, until its handler physically dragged it away. Mike called off the search at noon. They stood in the parking lot, exhausted and rattled, while he made the official statement. "We've conducted extensive search operations for Christopher Hayes. At this time, we have no evidence of his current location. The case is being turned over to tribal police and federal investigators. The monument will remain open, but we're issuing a strong advisory against hiking alone, especially at dawn and dusk." As people dispersed, Mike pulled Thomas aside. "Off the record, I've done SAR for 20 years, found bodies in every condition imaginable, pulled people out of places that should have killed them, but I have never ever seen anything like this. Those tracks yesterday, I can't explain them. What we saw this morning, I can't explain that either. And I've got 3 trained search dogs who are now afraid of their own shadows." "What are you saying?" Mike looked out at the canyon, its walls glowing orange in the afternoon sun, beautiful and ancient, and utterly indifferent to human understanding. "I'm saying there are things in this world that don't fit in our neat categories. And maybe, we're not supposed to understand them. Maybe we're just supposed to stay the hell away. That night, Thomas sat in his apartment with his gun on the table and made a decision that would have horrified the person he'd been 72 hours ago. He was going to talk to Julie's grandmother. Not as a ranger collecting data, but as someone who needed to understand what was happening. Even if that understanding came from sources his academic training would never accept as valid. Julie picked him up at 8 p.m., driving in silence through Chinle to a small house near the edge of town. Her grandmother, Mrs. Tazosi, 93 years old, eyes sharp as obsidian, sat in a chair by the window waiting. "You saw it," she said in Navajo. Julie translated. "You saw the Yinald Lushi." Thomas nodded. "I saw something. I don't know what it was." The old woman spoke for 5 minutes, her voice soft but steady, while Julie translated haltingly, sometimes struggling for English words that matched the Navajo concepts. Yinald Lushi, literally, he who walks on all fours, but that was inadequate translation. It meant witches who had gone past taboo, who had killed family members, who had broken fundamental laws, and gained the power to wear animal skins and transform. They could become coyotes, wolves, ravens, owls. They could run at speeds impossible for humans. They could mimic voices perfectly. And they needed something from the living, not just to kill, but to sustain themselves, to continue existing in their twisted state. "When they take someone," Mrs. Sosi said, "they don't just kill. They put on that person like clothing, wear their face, their voice, use them up until there's nothing left. Then they need another." "Christopher Hayes," Thomas whispered. "The man who disappeared. He's gone. What walks in the canyon now wearing his shape, that's not him. Don't look for him. Don't call his name. Don't acknowledge it if it speaks with his voice." She leaned forward. "And whatever you do, don't invite it in. They can't enter a home without invitation. Can't cross certain barriers. Your grandmother's grandmother knew this. All humans knew this once." Thomas drove home alone, Julie having insisted on staying with her grandmother. His apartment building looked exactly as it had every night for 3 years. Parking lot, security lights, cottonwood tree, his window on the second floor. Nothing had changed physically. But Thomas saw it differently now. Saw the spaces between lights where things might stand watching. Saw his window as a fragile barrier. Saw the whole structure of his rational worldview cracking under the weight of what he'd witnessed. He parked, but didn't get out, sitting in his truck, staring at his apartment. Christopher Hayes had been a real person, 34 years old, married, experienced hiker, probably had hobbies and dreams and people who loved him. Now something was using his body like a costume, walking around the canyon at night looking for others. Thomas's phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. "Thomas, it's Christopher. I'm okay. I'm hiding. Can you meet me? I need help." His hands went cold. He stared at the message, watching as 3 dots appeared, indicating another text being composed. "I'm scared, Thomas. Something's hunting me. Please help." He should delete this, block the number, but his analytical mind kicked in, demanding data. He texted back, "Where are you?" The response came immediately. "Canyon. White House Trail. Come alone. It can't know you're coming." Thomas sat in his truck, phone in hand, staring at messages from something pretending to be a dead man. Every rational instinct screamed that this was bait, a trap, something luring him into darkness. But another part of him, smaller, quieter, but growing stronger since this nightmare began, wondered what would happen if he did nothing. How many more people would disappear while he sat paralyzed by fear? He texted Julie, "Going back to the canyon. If I don't contact you by dawn, call it in." Her response came in seconds. "Don't. Thomas, please don't go down there." But he was already driving, his truck's headlights cutting through the October darkness, the gun heavy in his jacket pocket. He wasn't going because he believed he could help Christopher Hayes. Christopher Hayes was beyond help if Mrs. Tsosi was right. He was going because he needed to understand, needed to see, needed to confirm that what his rational mind rejected was absolutely real. The White House ruins trailhead was empty at 11:47 p.m. Thomas sat in his truck for 10 minutes, staring at the trail entrance, its wooden sign barely visible in his headlights. Then he grabbed his flashlight, his radio, his gun, and stepped out into the cold desert night. The trail descended into absolute darkness. His flashlight beam seemed inadequate, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the canyon. Every shadow could hide something. Every sound, wind through juniper, small animals in the brush, his own footsteps on packed earth, felt amplified and threatening. He'd walked this trail dozens of times in daylight. It was easy, well-maintained, safe. But at midnight, alone, knowing something was down here waiting, it became a descent into hell. The footprints appeared halfway down, illuminated by his flashlight beam. Boot prints, size 11, matching Christopher Hayes's last known tracks. But these were fresh, made within the last few hours. And as Thomas knelt to examine them, his stomach lurched. The prints were wrong. The right boot made normal impressions, but the left boot's prints were backwards. Heel where toes should be, toes where heels should be, as if whoever was making them had their left foot on backwards. Thomas stood quickly, swinging his flashlight in a circle. The canyon walls pressed in, darker than the sky above. Nothing moved, nothing made sound, but he felt watched, felt eyes on him from multiple directions, felt the weight of attention from something that didn't blink or breathe like humans do. "Christopher?" His voice sounded too small. "Are you there?" Silence. Then from somewhere ahead, down where the trail approached the ruins, "Thomas, thank God, I'm here, I'm hurt." Christopher's voice. Perfect recreation, every inflection exact. But it came from the wrong direction. Not from the trail, but from 20 feet up the canyon wall where no human could stand. Thomas pointed his flashlight up. Two eyes reflected back, 30 feet off the ground, glowing yellow-green in the beam. They were too far apart, set in a face he couldn't quite resolve, angular and stretched. As he watched, the thing holding those eyes moved, not climbing down the wall, but flowing down it like liquid, defying gravity, bones bending in ways that made Thomas's vision blur. He ran. Thomas Whitaker, who'd spent 11 years analyzing patterns and trusting data, abandoned all of that and ran back up the trail. Behind him, he heard pursuit. Not footsteps, but the sound of something large moving fast, scraping against rocks, breathing with a wet, rasping sound that couldn't come from human lungs. He didn't look back. Looking back would mean seeing it clearly, understanding exactly what was chasing him, and some desperate part of his brain insisted that not knowing might be the only thing keeping him sane. His flashlight beam bounced wildly as he sprinted up the switchbacks, his radio banging against his hip, his gun forgotten in his pocket because what use was a gun against something that moved like water and spoke with the voices of the dead? The thing behind him called out in Christopher's voice. "Thomas, wait. Please, I need help." Then, as if realizing the charade no longer worked, it switched to Julie's voice. "Thomas, stay here. Don't leave me." Then his own voice, speaking words he'd never said. "I want to stay in the canyon. I want to stay forever." He burst out of the trail entrance at 12:33 a.m., stumbling into the parking lot, his lungs burning. His truck sat where he'd left it. Nothing followed him out of the darkness, or if it did, it stopped at the boundary where canyon met human territory. Thomas sat in his truck, hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the steering wheel, and stared at the trail entrance. Nothing emerged. The darkness remained empty, innocent, giving back no evidence of what it contained. He drove to the NPS office, let himself in, and sat at his desk until dawn broke over Canyon de Chelly. At 6:47 a.m., he submitted his resignation, citing personal reasons. At 8:15 a.m., he was on the phone with his sister in Colorado, asking if he could stay with her for a while. At 11:30 a.m., his truck was packed with essentials. Julie found him in the parking lot at noon. She didn't ask what had happened. She just looked at his face and nodded slowly. "My grandmother said you'd leave." She said the ones who see them clearly either leave or become them. There's no middle ground. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. "Don't be. You did the right thing. The canyon keeps what it keeps. We can't change that. We can only live beside it and respect what we don't understand." Thomas drove north on Highway 191, watching Canyon de Chelly disappear in his rearview mirror. The case of Christopher Hayes would officially remain unsolved. SAR would eventually suspend active searching. His wife would grieve and move on, or not move on. The Yinald Lushi would continue doing whatever it did down in those ancient canyons, wearing faces that weren't its own, calling names and voices stolen from the dead. And Thomas Whitaker, who'd once believed that everything could be explained with enough data, would spend the rest of his life knowing exactly what had happened, and knowing that no one would ever believe him if he tried to explain. 3 months later, working as a logistics coordinator for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Thomas got an email from an account he didn't recognize. No subject line, no message, just an attached image. He should have deleted it unopened. But his analytical instincts hadn't fully died, so he clicked it. The photograph showed the White House ruins overlook at dawn, taken from the exact spot where Christopher Hayes had last been seen. In the foreground, positioned carefully on a rock, was a ranger's hat. Thomas's hat, the one he'd worn the day Christopher disappeared, the one he'd been certain was in his apartment when he packed. But that wasn't what made his hands go numb. In the background, barely visible in the early morning light, a figure stood at the canyon's edge. Too tall, too thin, proportions subtly wrong. It faced the camera directly, and it was wearing Thomas's face. The email address was Christopher Hayes's personal Gmail account. Thomas stared at the image for 5 minutes, his coffee growing cold beside his keyboard. Then he deleted the email, blocked the sender, and cleared his trash folder. He told himself it was photoshopped. A sick prank. Someone's idea of a joke. But that night, lying in bed in his sister's spare room, 400 miles from Canyon de Chelly, Christopher Bennett had been documenting anomalies for 11 years before Olympic National Park broke him. His ranger station office resembled a detective's war room more than a wilderness outpost. 3 filing cabinets stuffed with incident reports cross-referenced by date, location, and atmospheric conditions. Topographic maps plastered across every wall with colored pins marking disappearances, animal behavior aberrations, and atmospheric disturbances that defied meteorological explanation. His colleagues called him obsessive. His ex-wife called him sick. Christopher called it pattern recognition, the same skill that made him a decent criminal investigator in Tacoma before the Henderson case drove him into the woods. The Henderson case. Murdered family, symbols carved into floorboards. The father found 3 days later speaking Romanian, though he'd never left Washington state. Christopher's report mentioned possible ritual elements. His lieutenant mentioned mandatory psychiatric evaluation. 6 months later, Christopher wore a different uniform and told himself the trees wouldn't lie to him the way people did. October 2009 brought early darkness to the Hoh rainforest, that peculiar twilight that settles between the ancient Sitka spruces like fog made solid. Christopher's Garmin eTrex GPS, reliable, simple, no unnecessary features, read 47.885 97 degree on, 123.93552 degree W when the call came through on his Motorola radio. Missing persons, 4 university students. Last known position, Upper Hoh River Trail, mile marker 9.2, elevation 1,240 feet. How long? Christopher asked, already pulling his incident kit from beneath his desk. Camera, evidence bags, compass, first aid supplies, the leather-bound notebook he'd carried since Tacoma. 48 hours, dispatch crackled back. Supposed to check in yesterday morning. Professor at UW Seattle reported it. Says they were doing folklore research. Christopher felt something twist behind his sternum, that familiar tightness that preceded every Henderson case memory. What kind of folklore? Static, then. Something about Romanian settlers. Early 1900s. You want me to... Send me everything. I'm heading out in 20. He already knew he wouldn't need 20 minutes. The filing cabinet's third drawer held a folder labeled Ho Valley Anomalies 1892 Present. Christopher had compiled it over 7 years, collecting fragments from county historical societies, translated immigrant letters, old ranger reports filed away and forgotten, the Romanian colony, the winter of 1897, 17 deaths in 3 months, all attributed to mountain fever, though no fever presented. The survivors scattered to Seattle and Portland. The settlement buildings burned to foundations that Park Service crews still occasionally stumbled across, overgrown with sword ferns and salal. Christopher pulled the folder. His hands didn't shake. They never did during the preliminary phase. The shaking came later during analysis, when patterns emerged and his mind tried to reject what his data proved. Inside, photocopies of letters written in Romanian, with Christopher's painstaking English translations penciled in margins. Maria Constantinescu to her sister in Bucharest, March 1897. Vasile came back wrong. He died of the coughing sickness, but 3 nights later, Anna saw him at the window. He spoke her name. She opened the door. Now Anna coughs blood and smiles at nothing, and last night she went to the forest. We found her clothes by the river, but not Anna. Father Simeon says we must. The letter ended there, torn or burned. Christopher photographed every page with his Nikon D90, transferred the images to his laptop, backed them up on 2 separate flash drives. Process, documentation, evidence chain, the rituals that kept him sane. The students were from UW's comparative folklore program. Names: Rachel Kensington, group leader, age 24, doctorate candidate. Thomas Moreau, 22. Jennifer Yu, 23. David Ostrowski, 21. Their research proposal, attached to the missing persons report, referenced syncretistic death rituals among Eastern European immigrant communities in Pacific Northwest isolated settlements. Academic language for, they'd heard the same stories Christopher had found. He locked his station at 14:47 hours, October 23, 2009. The sky held that peculiar green-gray color that preceded heavy rain in the rainforest, though his weather radio insisted clear conditions for the next 72 hours. Christopher had learned not to trust technology over his own observations. The air tasted of copper and rotting wood. The Sitka spruces surrounding the ranger station stood motionless, despite wind audible in their upper branches, a rustling like whispered conversation in languages older than English. The drive to Ho River Trailhead took 37 minutes. Christopher's truck passed 2 other vehicles, unusual for late October, when tourist traffic dropped to nearly zero. The rainforest reclaimed its silence in autumn, that cathedral-like hush broken only by the river's constant growl and the occasional scream of a Roosevelt elk. Christopher had always found the quiet comforting. Today it felt like held breath. He parked at 15:24 hours. The student's vehicle remained in the lot. A blue 2005 Honda CR-V, Washington plates, university parking permit visible through the windshield. Christopher photographed it from 4 angles, noted the slight frost on the windows despite the temperature reading 47 degrees on his truck's external thermometer. Frost shouldn't form until at least 32 degrees. He scraped a sample into an evidence bag, labeled it, documented the discrepancy. The CR-V's doors were locked. Christopher peered through the windows with his flashlight. Camping gear piled in back, a cardboard file box labeled Primary Sources, Romanian Settlement, energy bar wrappers, empty coffee cups, nothing unusual. Except, he moved his light slowly across the pile. There, half hidden beneath a sleeping bag, a book with a cracked leather spine and no visible title. Christopher tried the doors again. Still locked. He could call the sheriff's department, get them to pop it legally, but that meant waiting 3 hours minimum and the light was already failing. He made a command decision, exigent circumstances, potential evidence, and used his baton on the rear passenger window. The glass starred but didn't shatter. He hit it again. The sound echoed too long in the parking lot, bouncing between the trees like laughter. The book felt wrong in his hands. Not temperature wrong, though it was oddly warm, but weight wrong, texture wrong, like holding something that existed slightly out of phase with normal matter. The leather wasn't leather, too smooth, too plastic. Christopher didn't let himself think about what it might actually be. No title on the cover. He opened it carefully. Handwritten pages in cramped Romanian script, interspersed with diagrams, circles, pentagrams, human figures with annotations. Christopher's Romanian was functional, learned specifically for researching the settlement, but this was older dialect, formal, ecclesiastical. He could make out phrases. Pentru a opri strigoi, to stop the strigoi. Sânge de nevinovat, blood of the innocent. Cinci nopți după moarte, 5 nights after death. His hands started shaking. Christopher forced himself to photograph every page, 47 pages total. His camera's date stamp would prove he'd found this before anything else happened. Evidence, documentation, chain of custody. He placed the book in his pack, marked the CRV's window breakage in his incident log, and started up the trail at 15:52 hours. The Upper Ho River Trail was one of the park's most remote paths, 18 miles of narrow track threading through old-growth forest so dense that noon felt like dusk. Christopher had hiked it 20 times in 7 years. He knew every switchback, every creek crossing, every campsite. The forest didn't change here. Trees that had stood for 800 years wouldn't noticeably alter in a human lifetime, except today they had. Christopher noticed it after the first mile. The trail markers, small wooden signs bolted to trees at regular intervals, were wrong. Not missing. Wrong. The distance carved into each marker no longer matched his GPS readings. Mile marker 1.5 appeared at 1.3 miles. Mile marker 2 appeared at 1.7 miles. Christopher stopped, checked his GPS, rechecked his position against his topographic map. The GPS was accurate. The trail itself had changed. He documented the discrepancy with photographs and notes. Possible explanations. Markers moved by vandals, unlikely. The bolts showed no signs of removal. GPS error, unlikely. He'd verified the device that morning against known coordinates. Map error, unlikely. These were USGS maps, recently updated. Remaining explanation. The trail had physically altered its geometry. Christopher kept walking. His breath formed visible clouds despite the temperature. The sound of the Ho River, usually audible as a constant background rumble, had vanished. The forest was perfectly, impossibly silent. At mile 3.2, according to his GPS, though the marker read 3.6, Christopher found the first sign. A piece of red fabric tied to a branch, too high for animals, too deliberate for accident. He photographed it, collected it. The fabric was cheap polyester, the kind used in budget rain jackets. It looked new. No weathering, no fading. Rachel Kensington's equipment list included a red North Face rain jacket. He found 6 more markers over the next 2 miles, each one placed at precise intervals, each one leading deeper into the forest and away from established trails. Christopher's training said follow the markers. Lost hikers left trail signs for searchers. His instinct said this wasn't about being found. This was about being followed. The 6th marker brought him to a clearing he'd never seen before, though his GPS insisted he'd passed within 50 feet of this location on a dozen previous hikes. The clearing was roughly circular, 30 feet in diameter, absolutely level ground in terrain that had no level ground. The grass was dead, not winter dormant dead, burned dead, though no fire had touched the surrounding trees. In the center, a cairn of river stones, carefully stacked, deliberate. Christopher approached slowly, camera out. The stones were covered in carvings, not modern graffiti. Old symbols, precise and deep, weathered by decades but still readable to anyone who'd spent 7 years researching the settlement. Protection symbols from Romanian folklore, the solar cross, the 6-petaled rose, the broken circle that represented defeated death, and beneath them, scratched over them with fresh tools, recent work, inverted crosses, pentagrams. Words in Romanian that Christopher's brain refused to immediately translate, because translation meant acknowledgement, meant accepting what he was seeing. Noya ikimamanapoy. We call them back. Christopher's hands were shaking badly now. He forced himself to photograph everything. The cairn, the symbols, the clearing, the way the trees at the clearing's edge all leaned inward, as if pulled by gravity that shouldn't exist. The way the moss on their trunks grew in spiral patterns. The way his compass needle spun lazily rather than pointing north. His Garmin GPS chose that moment to die. Not battery failure. The battery indicator showed full. The screen simply went black, stayed black, didn't respond to any button combination. Christopher tried his cell phone. No signal, which was normal. But the phone's clock was wrong. It read 11:47 p.m. October 25th, 2 days into the future, 11 hours into the night. Christopher looked up. The sky was still twilight green-gray. His watch read 17:34 October 23rd. His phone insisted otherwise. He breathed slowly, deliberately, the way his Tacoma psychiatrist had taught him. Process the evidence. Don't jump to conclusions. Electronics fail in forests, moisture, temperature fluctuations, magnetic anomalies from mineral deposits. The Henderson case was 7 years ago. This was not the Henderson case. His radio crackled, not static. Voice, distant, overlapping voices speaking in harmony. Christopher, Stichaugasit. You know what I found. You know what they found. Christopher keyed his radio with hands that wouldn't stay steady. This is Ranger Bennett, identify yourself. The voices laughed. Multiple people laughing in perfect synchronization. Vino sa vez cheramunican credința moare. Come see what remains when faith dies. The radio went silent. Christopher stood in the clearing with his dead GPS, his impossible phone, his spinning compass, and the certain knowledge that he'd crossed some threshold he couldn't identify, into circumstances he couldn't rationalize. Following students who'd found something that shouldn't be found. The 7th trail marker was visible at the clearing's far edge, pointing deeper into the forest. Christopher checked his gear. Flashlight functional. First aid kit present. Water bottles full. The leather-bound book in his pack seemed to pulse against his spine, warm through the fabric. He had 3 hours of daylight remaining. The ranger station was 4 miles behind him. Standard procedure said return to base, call for additional personnel, request search and rescue teams. Christopher had followed standard procedure all his life. It had never saved anyone. He followed the 7th marker. The trail became less trail and more suggestion. Christopher marked his path with orange surveyor's tape every 100 feet, tied to branches at eye level, making sure he could find his way back. His training was automatic now, mechanical, keeping his hands busy while his mind tried to process the impossible data accumulating in his notebook. The forest was changing around him, subtly at first, then undeniably. The Sitka spruces were being replaced by different trees, old trees, twisted trees, species Christopher couldn't identify despite years of wilderness education. Their bark was wrong, too smooth, almost skin-like. Their branches moved without wind, reaching toward him as he passed, close enough that he felt the whisper of contact, but never quite touching. At 18:15, according to his watch, though the light suggested hours later, Christopher found the camp. 4 tents arranged in a careful square, a cold fire pit, backpacks hung properly in trees to protect them from animals. Everything neat, organized, following wilderness protocols exactly. Except no one was there, and the tents were facing inward, toward the center of the square, as if the occupants had wanted to watch something together. Christopher photographed everything before approaching. The tents were modern, REI brand, quality equipment. No damage, no signs of struggle. The camp was simply abandoned neatly, deliberately by people who'd intended to return. He checked the first tent, empty sleeping bag still zipped, a paperback novel, Stephen King's Pet Cemetery, bookmark at page 187, reading glasses folded on top, a water bottle, nothing else. Second tent, empty, sleeping bag unrolled, a journal on the ground sheet, open. Christopher read the last entry, written in small, careful handwriting. October 22nd, 11:30 p.m. We shouldn't have read the invocations aloud. Rachel said it was just academic exercise documenting pronunciation, but Thomas heard something answer. I heard it too. 3 knocks on 3 different trees, perfectly timed. Then voici in torse. I will return. We're performing the binding ritual tomorrow morning. David has the materials. Father Simeon's instructions were very specific. Hawthorn stakes, sanctified salt, prayers to St. Andrew. If the stories are true, if the settlement deaths were really Strigoi, we can document the original countermeasures. This could be the most important folkloristic evidence collected in decades. Rachel is so excited. I'm just tired. I keep dreaming about someone at my tent, whispering my name. Jennifer. Christopher read the entry 3 times. His flashlight beam seemed dimmer, though the batteries were fresh. The tent fabric around him felt too close, too warm, breathing close. The 3rd and 4th tents revealed similar scenes. Abandoned comfort, interrupted routine. No blood, no violence, just absence. Christopher found their research materials in a waterproof equipment box, photocopied documents, translated letters, photographs of the original settlement ruins, and printouts, recent printouts from the University of Washington Library archives. Letters Christopher hadn't seen before. Letters dated 1897, written after the supposed settlement abandonment. He read them by flashlight, sitting on a log in the camp's center, trying to keep his hands from shaking hard enough to drop the papers. Father Ioan Simeon, to Archbishop Vladimir, Portland Diocese, April 1897. Your Grace, I write with terrible news. The binding failed. We followed the traditional methods, hawthorn through the heart, salt in the mouth, prayers of St. Andrew. But Vasile Constantinescu rose on the 5th night as the old texts warned. He is changed. He is other. He has taken 3 more, and those 3 rose on their 5th nights. The mathematics of this spread is apocalyptic. We are attempting the ritual of true death from the book of St. Cyprian, though it requires elements I pray God forgives us for using. I fear our faith is not strong enough. I fear these American trees hold no holiness. I fear. The letter ended mid-sentence. Christopher felt cold that had nothing to do with temperature. The book of St. Cyprian, the grimoire in his pack pulled from the student's car. Christopher looked at the equipment box. Empty space about the right size for a book. They'd been carrying it. They'd brought it to the clearing. A sound pulled him from the documents. Footsteps. Multiple footsteps moving through the forest with perfect synchronization like soldiers marching. Christopher grabbed his flashlight, aimed it toward the sound. 4 figures stood at the edge of the camp. Young people, college age, wearing hiking clothes, standing absolutely still, absolutely silent, watching him with expressions that didn't quite match human expressions. Too neutral, too empty, like masks pulled over something else. Rachel Kensington? Christopher kept his voice level, professional. I'm Ranger Bennett, we've been searching for you. The figure on the left tilted its head. The movement was wrong, joints bending at angles joints shouldn't bend. Ranger Bennett, it said in a voice like wind through broken glass. You brought it back. Brought what back? All 4 pointed at his pack, at the book. Father Simeon burned that, the figure continued. Not Rachel's voice anymore. Something older, something foreign using her vocal cords like borrowed instruments. Burned it with prayers and salt in the old faith. But Americans don't believe in old faith. Americans dig up everything and call it research. Christopher's hand moved to his radio. Dead. Of course it was dead. We waited, another figure said. Thomas, maybe. Or what had been Thomas. 112 years in the ground, in the cold, in the earth that doesn't sleep. And they called us back. Read the words, spoke the names, opened the door. The ritual requires 5 nights, the 3rd figure whispered. They read the invocation on the first night. Tonight is the fifth night. Tonight we return completely. Tonight we become what they called us to become. Christopher understood then, with the sick clarity that had hit him during the Henderson case, during the moment he'd realized the symbols carved into that family's floor were functional, were operational, were invitations to something that had accepted. The students hadn't disappeared. They'd succeeded. They'd proven the folklore was real. And proof meant consequence. "Where are they?" Christopher asked. "Where are the actual students?" The four figures smiled in perfect unison. Their teeth were too white, too sharp, catching his flashlight beam and reflecting it like animal eyes. "We are the students, Ranger Bennett. We are what remains when the ritual completes." Host and guest merged. The body continues. The soul. The figure that had been Rachel made a dismissive gesture. "Souls are fuel. Faith is fuel. The Strigoi feeds on belief." Christopher ran. He had no better response, no rational strategy, just pure animal panic overriding his training. He crashed through the forest, following his orange surveyor's tape in reverse, hearing footsteps behind him that never hurried, that matched his pace exactly, that suggested pursuit was just formality, entertainment, playing with food before feeding. His flashlight caught trees that moved, that bent deliberately into his path, branches reaching for his clothes, his pack, trying to snag the book. Christopher dodged, ducked, kept running. His lungs burned, his legs cramped. His mind screamed at him that this wasn't real, couldn't be real. Forests didn't move and people didn't change and the dead didn't return, except this was the Henderson case all over again. Except this time he couldn't write a report and get dismissed. This time he was inside the impossible, and the impossible was hunting him. He burst into the clearing with the cairn and stopped. The four figures were already there, standing around the stone pile, waiting for him. They'd moved impossibly fast, or the forest had folded space, or Christopher was losing his mind in real time. "You can't run from us," Rachel Thing said. "The forest is ours now, was always ours. The settlement understood that in the end. Why do you think they burned everything? Why do you think Father Simeon died by his own hand? Because the binding failed and the only way to stop Strigoi is to starve them, deny them hosts, deny them believers, deny them names and stories and memory." "But you couldn't do that," Thomas Thing added. "You had to document, had to cross-reference, had to build your filing cabinets of evidence. You fed us with your research, Ranger Bennett. You kept the memory alive. And then these four little scholars came with their academic curiosity and their recitations and gave us perfect new vessels." Christopher's hand found the book in his pack. It burned against his palm, fever hot, vibrating. He pulled it out. The figures flinched backward. "You want this," Christopher said. It wasn't a question. "We need it destroyed," Jennifer Thing whispered. "It's the only thing that can undo what was done. The ritual of true death." Page 33. Saint. Cyprian knew how to bind creatures like us. Really bind us. Permanently. Christopher opened the book to page 33. The handwriting was different here, fresher, written over the original Romanian text. English. Father Simeon's handwriting, if the signature at the bottom meant anything. Instructions. Specific instructions. Materials required. Prayers to recite. Timing that had to be exact. "To truly kill a Strigoi," Christopher read aloud, "requires willing sacrifice. The ritual must be performed by one who has willingly sought understanding, who has opened themselves to belief, who has prepared the way through research and documentation. The investigator becomes the instrument. The seeker becomes the offering. Blood of the faithful, freely given, sanctifies the ground. The Strigoi cannot touch sanctified ground, cannot cross it, cannot exist in proximity to genuine sacrifice." Christopher looked up at the four figures. They stood perfectly still now, watching him with expressions that had shifted from predatory to afraid. "You're not trying to kill me," Christopher said slowly. "You're trying to get me to kill myself. That's what Father Simeon did. That's what the ritual requires." Rachel Thing's face twisted. The students aren't dead yet. Not completely. The merger takes 5 days. Tonight was night 5, but dawn isn't here yet. You have until sunrise. If you perform the ritual before then, you sanctify this clearing, trap us here, and the students can still be saved. The host bodies can be purified. We'd be driven out. But the ritual requires my death. Yes. Christopher felt very calm suddenly, very clear. The shaking in his hands stopped. This was just data. This was just analysis. The Henderson case had taught him that some truths existed whether you believed them or not. That symbol and ritual and faith operated in the world as surely as gravity and electricity. That folklore was sometimes just forgotten science. He'd spent 7 years studying this, 7 years preparing, though he hadn't known what he was preparing for. Every cross-reference, every translated letter, every documented anomaly had led here. Pattern recognition. He'd always been good at seeing patterns. There's another option, Christopher said. The figures tilted their heads in unison. Christopher pulled his satellite messenger from his pack, the one device that still worked, because it operated on completely different technology. I can call in coordinates, napalm this entire section of forest. Burn it like the original settlement was burned. You're bound to this location, aren't you? The old grounds? The place where you first rose? Fire would destroy you. Fire would kill the students immediately, David Thing said. Fire doesn't purify Strigoi hosts. It just burns, traps them in dead bodies forever, conscious, eternal suffering. Christopher looked at the book, at the ritual, at the requirements. He thought about his ex-wife's last words to him. You care more about your mysteries than you care about people. He thought about the Henderson case, about writing reports while a family lay dead. He thought about 11 years of documentation, of building evidence walls, of treating human tragedy like data to be processed. He thought about 4 students who'd made the academic mistake of believing folklore was just stories. If I do this, Christopher said, if I perform the ritual, you swear the students survive? We swear on the old names, all 4 figures said together. We swear by St. Cyprian and St. Andrew. We swear by the laws that bind even us. Christopher had no reason to trust them. But he had 7 years of research that said some laws were absolute, that some oaths were binding, that the old rules worked when applied correctly. He set up the ritual according to Father Simeon's instructions. He used his knife to carve the protective symbols into the trees surrounding the clearing. The solar cross, the 6-petaled rose, the broken circle. He poured salt from his emergency supplies in a perfect circle around the cairn. He lit 4 small fires in the cardinal directions using his waterproof matches and kindling from his pack. The figures watched, unable to enter the circle he'd created, unable to stop him. The final instruction was simple. The blood must be given willingly at the moment of belief. The investigator must accept that faith is real, that the old powers persist, that sacrifice has meaning. Only then does the blood sanctify. Christopher stood in the center of his circle and thought about pattern recognition, about the moment data became truth. He thought about Rachel Kensington and Thomas Moreau and Jennifer Yu and David Ostrowski, who'd wanted to document folklore and gotten consumed by it. He thought about his filing cabinets full of unsolved anomalies, about all the people who'd disappeared into patterns he'd mapped but never intervened in. He opened his knife. The blade was carbon steel, old, carried from his Tacoma days. The figures at the circle's edge were screaming now, inhuman sounds, as if they sensed what he was about to do. Christopher pressed the blade to his left wrist. He thought about belief, about faith, about whether 7 years of documentation counted as preparation for this moment, or just elaborate procrastination. He pulled the knife across his wrist. The cut was clean, professional, exactly deep enough. Blood fell onto the salted ground. Where it landed, the earth hissed, steamed, began to glow with dim red light. The figures shrieked and collapsed. Their bodies convulsed, jerked, twisted. Something dark and formless pulled itself out of Rachel's mouth, out of Thomas's eyes, out of Jennifer and David's screaming faces. 4 shadow things writhing, trying to escape the circle's boundaries. Christopher cut his other wrist. More blood, more sanctification. The shadows burned like paper in fire. twisting, disintegrating, screaming in voices that sounded like wind through broken glass, like Romanian prayers spoken backward, like everything the forest had witnessed for 112 years finally being released. Christopher's vision was graying at the edges. He felt cold, felt distant, felt himself becoming data to be documented. He watched Rachel's body stop convulsing, watched her eyes blink and clear and become human again, watched all 4 students gasp and wake and stare at him with horror and recognition. "Document it," Christopher told them. His voice sounded very far away. "Write down everything, every symbol, every word, every requirement. Make it real, make it available. So the next time someone needs to know, the next time something like this happens, they won't have to figure it out alone." Rachel was crying, crawling toward him. "We can save you. We can—" "You can't," Christopher said. "It was just data, just observable fact. The ritual requires completion, but you're alive. That's what matters. That's what I was documenting all along, how to keep people alive." His legs wouldn't hold him anymore. Christopher sat down in the center of his circle, surrounded by his salt and his fires and his blood-soaked ground, and felt something enormous settle over him. Not death exactly, something older, something the ritual had invoked, a presence that examined him, judged him, found his sacrifice acceptable. The last thing Christopher saw before the gray became black was Rachel Kensington picking up his notebook, opening it to a blank page, and beginning to write, beginning to document, continuing his work. The last thing he heard was the forest exhaling, releasing tension it had held for 112 years, letting go of the dead that had been trapped in its soil, finally allowing them to rest. The last thing he felt was satisfaction, pattern recognition. He'd finally solved the case. They found Christopher Bennett's body at dawn on October 24, 2009, in a clearing the GPS coordinates didn't match, surrounded by symbols carved into trees and salt poured in perfect circles. They found 4 university students alive, dehydrated and traumatized but physically unharmed, with a story no one believed about Romanian folklore and creatures in the forest, and a ranger who'd sacrificed himself to save them. They found his notebooks, 3 of them, filled with 7 years of meticulous documentation, cross-references, translated letters, and evidence of patterns that officially didn't exist. The notebooks were sealed as evidence, then quietly disappeared into university archives where doctorate candidates occasionally found them and wrote skeptical papers about obsessive pattern-seeking behavior in isolation and folie à plusieurs in wilderness settings. They found a leather-bound book that shouldn't have existed, filled with Romanian prayers and ritual instructions and Father Ioan Simeon's handwritten addendum about true death and willing sacrifice. The book was photographed, cataloged, and sent to the University of Washington's Special Collections, where it sits in climate-controlled storage, checked out occasionally by students researching Eastern European folklore. They found Rachel Kensington's final journal entry, written in Christopher Bennett's notebook while he bled out in front of her. He believed. That was the key. The ritual requires belief, genuine acceptance that the old powers are real. Christopher Bennett spent 7 years documenting the impossible and maintaining scientific skepticism right up until the moment he chose faith over data. He became what Father Simeon was, an investigator who understood that some truths require sacrifice to validate. I don't know if we'll ever be able to explain what happened here. I don't know if anyone will believe us. But Christopher was right about one thing. Documentation matters. Evidence matters. Keeping the memory alive matters. Because someday, somewhere, someone else is going to need to know that the folklore is real, that the old ways work, that sacrifice still has power. This is for them. This is proof. This is what happened in the Hoh rainforest in October 2009, when we called back the dead and a forest ranger saved us by believing in something bigger than data. Olympic National Park closed the Upper Hoh River Trail for 6 months. Official reason: landslide risk. Unofficial reason: 3 more rangers quit after seeing things in that forest they couldn't explain, and the Park Service decided some places were better left unvisited. The clearing where Christopher died was never found again, despite multiple attempts with his exact GPS coordinates. The forest had reclaimed it, or hidden it, or simply refused to reveal it to anyone who came looking. But hikers still occasionally find orange surveyor's tape tied to trees at eye level, marking a path that isn't on any map, leading deeper into the old growth than the established trails should allow. Smart hikers leave that tape alone. The curious ones follow it and usually come back with stories about clearings they can't quite remember, about symbols carved in bark, about the feeling of being watched by something that isn't there, and sometimes, not often but sometimes, the Park Service receives reports of a ranger seen on trails that no longer exist. A thin man with graying hair and a notebook, carefully documenting things that shouldn't exist, maintaining his vigil, continuing his research. The reports are filed away in archives no one reads. Pattern recognition only matters if someone's looking for patterns. But the patterns are there. They've always been there. Christopher Bennett just taught himself to see them, and in his final act of documentation he proved that seeing isn't enough. Understanding isn't enough. Sometimes the truth requires more than observation. Sometimes it requires belief, and blood, and the willingness to become data yourself, so others might survive. The Strigoi are gone from the Hoh rainforest, for now. Until someone else reads the old words and calls them back. Until the next curious researcher decides folklore is just stories worth investigating. But if that happens, they'll have Christopher Bennett's notebooks to guide them. His documentation, his sacrifice, his pattern, finally solved. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Daniel Hayes had been with the National Park Service for 6 years, and in that time he developed a reputation for being the ranger who actually read the incident reports. Not just skimmed them, read them, analyzed patterns, cross-referenced weather data with search and rescue outcomes. His colleagues at North Cascades National Park called him Database Dan behind his back, though never with malice. They needed someone who remembered that the Thornton Creek Trail washed out every third spring, or that cell service died completely above 4,800 feet on the eastern approaches. On October 18, 2015, Daniel was reviewing his notes on seasonal wildlife migration when the call came through on his Motorola radio. A day hiker had found an abandoned campsite near Cascade Pass, elevation 5,400 feet. Personal effects scattered. No signs of the camper. Probably just got spooked by a black bear and headed down without packing up, said Tommy Vickers, the seasonal ranger who'd taken the initial report. Happens all the time up there. Daniel clicked his pen 3 times, a nervous habit when his mind was already working through logistics. Did they leave a vehicle at the trailhead? Gray Honda CRV, registered to a Lauren Weber 29 Seattle address. Been there 4 days according to the parking permit. 4 days. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, though he couldn't identify the exact physiological mechanism. Anxiety manifested differently in different people. For him, it was a peculiar hollowness just below his sternum, as if his diaphragm had forgotten its purpose. "I'll head up," he said. "Get me the full vehicle description and any emergency contacts from the permit." Tommy's voice crackled back. "Dan, it's getting late. Trail takes 3 hours minimum, and weather's turning. Could wait until morning." 4 days, Daniel repeated, already pulling his pack from the equipment locker. Garmin eTrex GPS unit, fully charged. First aid kit, updated last month. Headlamp with fresh batteries. Mylar emergency blanket. Water purification tablets. 600 milliliters of water in an Nalgene bottle. His mind automatically cataloged each item as it went into the pack. A mental checklist that served him better than any written version. The drive to the Cascade Pass trailhead took 40 minutes on roads that turned from asphalt to gravel, to something that only technically qualified as a road. Daniel's truck rattled over potholes that hadn't been there a week ago. The October rains were relentless this year, eroding everything they touched. By the time he parked next to Lauren Weber's CRV, The sky had taken on that peculiar leaden quality that preceded mountain weather, neither quite overcast nor clear, just oppressive. The Honda looked ordinary, too ordinary. No shattered windows, no signs of struggle, no helpful note tucked under the windshield wiper explaining a spontaneous change of plans. Daniel peered through the driver's side window and noted the interior's cleanliness. No fast food containers, no scattered belongings, just a Seattle Public Library bookmark resting on the passenger seat. Someone organized, someone who planned, someone who'd been gone for 4 days. The Cascade Pass Trail began with a deceptive gentleness, winding through old-growth forest where Douglas firs created a canopy so dense that the afternoon light arrived in discrete shafts, geometric and strange. Daniel's boots found their rhythm on the packed earth, but his mind remained engaged with the problem at hand. Statistical analysis of missing persons in the North Cascades suggested that 93% were located within 72 hours. Lauren Weber had crossed that threshold yesterday. The trail steepened after the first mile, switchbacking up the mountain face with the kind of monotonous intensity that turned hiking into a meditation on human stubbornness. Daniel's breathing stayed controlled, in through the nose, out through the mouth, maintaining oxygen efficiency at altitude. Around him, the forest began to change. The Douglas firs gave way to mountain hemlock and subalpine fir, trees that had adapted to shorter growing seasons and longer winters by becoming twisted, gnarled versions of their lowland cousins. At 4,200 feet, Daniel passed another hiker coming down, a man in his 50s with expensive Arc'teryx gear and the slightly dazed expression of someone who'd pushed themselves too hard. "How far to the pass?" the man asked, though he was clearly done for the day. "Another mile and 1,200 vertical feet," Daniel said. "You see anyone else up there?" "Campsite. No person, though. Looked like someone left in a hurry." The man adjusted his pack straps. Weird thing. All their food was still there. Open cans, torn packages, like they'd been eating and just stopped. Daniel felt that hollowness again, spreading. "Did you touch anything?" "Hell no." Looked wrong. Real wrong. The man glanced back up the trail, and something in his weathered face suggested he was remembering more than he wanted to say. "You going up there?" "That's the plan." "Be careful. Temperature dropped about 20 degrees once I got past those big rocks. Not natural the way it happened, just suddenly freezing." The man started moving again, clearly eager to put distance between himself and whatever he'd seen. "Not natural at all." Daniel continued climbing. The temperature observation was interesting. Microclimates existed in mountainous terrain, but a 20-degree drop over a short distance suggested either an unusually strong cold air drainage or an approaching front. He checked his handheld weather radio. No alerts, no warnings. Pressure holding steady at 2992 inches. Conditions should be stable. The big rocks turned out to be a talus field where ancient rock slides had deposited house-sized boulders in chaotic arrangements. Daniel picked his way through carefully, testing each foothold, aware that twisted ankles killed more hikers than dramatic falls. Beyond the talus, the trail emerged into subalpine meadow, and that's when he felt it. Cold. Not the gradual chill of increasing elevation, but something immediate and wrong, as if he'd stepped through an invisible barrier into winter. His breath emerged in clouds. The moisture on his face felt suddenly tacky, on the edge of freezing. Daniel stopped and pulled out his small thermometer keychain. 41 degrees Fahrenheit. 20 minutes ago, at only 300 feet lower elevation, it had been 58. 17 degrees in less than a quarter mile of horizontal distance. That wasn't a microclimate, that was impossible. The campsite sat in a small clearing where the trail opened onto the Cascade Pass proper, with views that should have been spectacular, jagged peaks, glacial valleys, the kind of scenery that made people understand why they'd tortured themselves hiking. Daniel barely noticed the vista, his attention locked onto the tent. It was a 2-person MSR Hubba Hubba, retail price approximately $300, suggesting Lauren Weber took her outdoor activities seriously. The tent fly rippled in a wind Daniel couldn't feel, and the entrance hung partially open, the zipper catch glinting in the failing light. "Lauren Weber?" he called, following protocol even though he knew the futility. "National Park Service. Anyone here?" Silence, except for that wind he couldn't feel making the tent fabric snap like a flag. Daniel approached slowly, documenting everything with the small digital camera he carried for incident reports. The tent's position, oriented properly to prevailing winds. The guy lines, correctly tensioned. The stake placement, textbook. This was someone who knew what they were doing, which made the scene inside more disturbing. Food containers lay scattered across the tent floor. A can of beans opened but barely touched. Granola bar wrappers torn apart with desperate violence. A Ziploc bag that had contained trail mix, now empty. The seal ripped rather than properly opened. And the smell, a sharp, acrid scent that Daniel's rational mind wanted to categorize as spoiled food, but his instincts identified as something else. Something organic and wrong. Lauren's backpack slumped against the far tent wall, its contents partially unpacked. Daniel pulled on examination gloves from his first aid kit before touching anything. Inside the pack, a sleeping bag still in its stuff sack. Extra clothes, neatly folded, a water filter, a paperback novel with a bookmark on page 47, and a journal. Daniel hesitated before opening the journal. Privacy concerns warred with investigative necessity, but 4 days missing in an abandoned camp tipped the balance. He flipped to the most recent entry, dated October 14th, the day Lauren had started her hike. The handwriting was careful, almost architectural in its precision. Reached Cascade Pass around 2 p.m., weather perfect. Set up camp with good views of Johannesburg and Cascade Peak. Planning to summit Saheli Arm tomorrow if conditions hold. Feeling strong, feeling ready. Normal, optimistic, the words of someone in control. The next entry, undated, was different. The handwriting had degraded, letters sprawling and uneven. So hungry, ate everything, still hungry. Why am I so hungry? It's cold, so cold. Something in the trees, watching, always watching. Can't stop eating, but nothing helps. The hunger is everything. Daniel's fingers went numb, and not from the temperature. He turned the page. The final entry was barely legible, written in what looked like a frantic scrawl. It spoke to me, in my head. Words I don't understand, but I understand. It wants so much. I want. We want. The hunger is beautiful and terrible, and I can't stop it. No one can stop it once it starts. You can never stop eating. The entry ended mid-word, trailing off into a smear of graphite where the pencil had dragged across the page. Daniel's hands were shaking. He set the journal down carefully, his mind trying to process what he'd read through a framework of rational explanation. Hypothermia could cause confusion. Altitude sickness manifested in cognitive impairment. Food poisoning led to delirium. But that handwriting progression, from controlled to chaotic, that suggested something rapid, something that had overcome her in less than a day. He photographed the journal pages, then the tent interior, then began a systematic search of the clearing. Lauren's boots sat outside the tent, laces still tied, which meant she'd left barefoot or in socks. The ground around the campsite showed scuff marks, disturbed pine needles, but no clear footprints. Daniel circled wider, looking for any trail leading away from the site. That's when he found the first print. It was in a patch of exposed dirt near the tree line, pressed deep enough to suggest significant weight. The shape made Daniel's rational mind stutter. Too long for a human foot, maybe 14 inches. But the toes, there were 5 of them. Definitely 5. Spread wide like fingers reaching for something, and the depth, pressing at least 2 inches into packed earth, indicated mass that shouldn't be walking on 2 legs. He photographed it from multiple angles, including a shot with his boot for scale. Then he found the second print, and the third. They led into the forest, spacing irregular, sometimes 6 feet apart, sometimes 12. Not a walking pattern, something else. Something that moved with bursts of speed and long pauses. Daniel checked his GPS. 5,012 feet elevation, 47.54 degree N, 121.0689 degree W. He noted the time, 5:47 p.m. Sunset in approximately 90 minutes. Standard protocol said to retreat, call for backup, return with proper search and rescue resources. But those prints were fresh. The edges hadn't begun to erode from wind or gravity. Lauren Weber might still be alive and somewhere in these woods. He followed the tracks. The forest here was different from the lower elevations. The trees grew sparse, bent by prevailing winds into permanent gestures of submission. Between them, shadows gathered with unusual density, as if the fading light was being absorbed rather than reflected. Daniel's headlamp cut through the gloom in a narrow beam that made everything outside its reach seem darker by contrast. The tracks led up a steep incline where no trail existed, forcing Daniel to use exposed roots and rocks for handholds. His breathing came harder now, not just from exertion, but from something else, something that made his chest feel squeezed. The air itself seemed to resist inhalation, heavy with moisture and that same wrong smell from the tent. Organic decay mixed with something sharp like ozone before lightning. At the top of the incline, the forest opened into a small hollow, where 3 massive Douglas firs had fallen years ago, creating a natural shelter beneath their interlocked trunks. Daniel's headlamp beam swept across the space and stopped on something pale. Bones. Not old bones, weathered by seasons and scavenged by animals. Fresh bones, some still glistening with residual moisture. They lay in a rough circle, deliberately arranged. Femurs, tibias, ribs, skulls that Daniel's training insisted must be animal skulls, elk or deer, anything but what his instincts whispered they might be. In the center of the circle, someone had scratched symbols into the exposed earth. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at. Lines that seemed to fold back on themselves in ways that denied basic spatial reasoning. Daniel's hands were shaking worse now, a fine tremor that made holding his camera difficult. He documented everything, trying to maintain professional detachment while his body prepared for fight or flight. Behind him, something snapped, a branch breaking under weight. He spun, headlamp beam slicing through darkness. Nothing. Just trees and shadows and that pervading cold that had somehow intensified, dropping from uncomfortable to actively painful. His exposed skin felt tight, on the verge of frostbite despite his layers. Lauren? His voice emerged smaller than intended, swallowed by the forest's oppressive silence. The response came not as words but as a sound, low, resonant, like a moan sliding across the bottom register of human vocal capacity and continuing down into something subsonic that Daniel felt in his bones rather than heard with his ears. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing between the trees until he couldn't determine direction or distance. Then, movement. At the edge of his headlamp's reach, something shifted. Tall. Too tall, moving with a gait that suggested joints bending in places where joints shouldn't exist. Daniel's training said stand your ground, make noise, appear large. His instincts said run. His rational mind tried desperately to categorize what he was seeing. Black bear standing upright, just a bear? Bears do that. But the proportions were wrong, the movement too deliberate, the way it cocked its head in response to his headlamp too calculating. It stepped forward, and for a moment Daniel's beam caught it fully. The creature stood perhaps 7 feet tall, emaciated to the point of impossibility, ribs clearly visible through skin that had the texture and color of freezer-burned meat. Its limbs were too long, arms reaching past where knees should be, fingers extended into points that might have been claws or might have been bones that had simply pushed through the skin and kept growing. But the face destroyed every rational explanation Daniel tried to construct. It was human, or had been. Female features still recognizable beneath the transformation. Skin pulled tight over a skull that had elongated slightly. Jaw distended to accommodate teeth that were too large, too numerous, crowding together in a mouth that couldn't fully close. The eyes were the worst, still human in shape and placement, but empty of everything except hunger, a terrible all-consuming need that radiated from them like heat from coals. The creature's mouth opened, impossibly wide, and it spoke. Not in English, not in any language Daniel recognized. The syllables felt ancient, predating language itself, raw sounds that bypassed his ears and printed themselves directly into his brain. He understood not through translation but through something more fundamental. Hungry. So hungry. Feed me. Feed. Join me. We hunger together. Beautiful hunger. Perfect hunger. Never stops, never ends, always more. Daniel ran. He crashed through the forest with none of the care he'd used ascending, branches tearing at his face and pack, exposed roots trying to trip him with every step. Behind him, that sound. Not footsteps, but something worse. A rapid clicking like bones snapping in sequence. Moving fast, too fast, impossibly fast for something that had looked barely able to stand. His headlamp beam bounced wildly, creating a strobe effect that made the trees seem to jump toward him. He cleared the fallen logs, half fell down the steep incline, caught himself on a boulder that scraped his palms even through his gloves. The clicking grew closer. He could feel its hunger reaching for him, a physical sensation like fingers made of ice pressing against the back of his neck. The campsite. He burst into the clearing where Lauren's tent still stood, and some distant part of his mind noted that the tent was different now. The fabric darkened, frost spreading across its surface in fractal patterns that seemed to grow as he watched. He didn't slow down. The trail. Get to the trail. Get below the cold line. Get to where reality made sense again. Something grabbed his pack. Daniel felt himself yanked backward with force that lifted him off his feet. He twisted, fumbling with the pack's sternum strap, and the clip released, dropping him free. He hit the ground rolling, came up running, and heard his pack tear apart behind him. Fabric shredding, equipment scattering, and over it all that voice in his head, that terrible understanding without words. Waste. You should hunger. You should join. We are beautiful together. The flesh remembers. The flesh always remembers. He reached the talus field and immediately regretted it. The rocks were treacherous in darkness, each gap a potential ankle breaker, each boulder a place where things could hide. But he had no choice. He jumped from rock to rock, balance precarious, and he could hear it behind him. That clicking getting closer, and now other sounds. Wet tearing, chewing. And he realized with horror that it had stopped to consume his pack, the canvas and plastic and everything else, feeding that endless hunger with materials that shouldn't be digestible. Daniel's foot slipped. He caught himself on an angled boulder, felt his knee twist wrong, kept moving anyway. Pain was information. Fear was information. Neither would stop him. He had to get down. Had to reach the tree line where the temperature normalized, where the world followed rules he understood. The clicking stopped. That was worse than hearing it. In the sudden silence, Daniel's own breathing sounded catastrophically loud, each gasp announcing his position. He froze, crouched behind a boulder, headlamp off now, trying to control his respiratory rate through sheer will. His injured knee throbbed in time with his pulse. Slowly, he reached for his radio. The plastic felt alien in his trembling fingers. He keyed the mic, keeping his voice to a bare whisper. "This is Ranger Hayes. Emergency at Cascade Pass. Require immediate." Static. Just static. But underneath it, something else. That voice, that terrible understanding pushing through the white noise. "Find you. Smell you. Taste you. Will wait. Have waited so long. Can wait forever. The hunger is patient." Daniel threw the radio away from him, heard it clatter across rocks. He moved in the opposite direction as quietly as possible, each placement of his hands and feet a conscious decision. The darkness felt absolute now, his night vision destroyed by the headlamp he didn't dare turn back on. He navigated by touch and memory, trying to orient himself toward where the trail should be. Behind him, above him, somewhere in that maze of boulders, the clicking resumed. But different now, multiple sources, multiple directions. As if what chased him had divided or was never one thing to begin with, or had called others to the hunt. Daniel's rational mind, that careful analytical framework he'd spent years building, began to fracture. Because he was hearing patterns in the clicks, rhythms that shouldn't exist in nature. They were coordinating, communicating, hurting him, He picked a direction and moved fast as he dared, trying to remember the talus field's layout from his ascent. The rocks gave way to scree, loose stones that slid underfoot, and he half ran, half fell down the slope, trading stealth for speed. The clicks converged behind him, closer now, and with them that cold, spreading like spilled liquid. The trail. His feet found packed earth, and he knew it instantly. Muscle memory from 6 years of hiking these mountains. He ran with everything he had, knee screaming protest, lungs burning in the freezing air, and the forest closed around him, but now it felt like protection. The familiar terrain of lower elevation where normal rules applied. He didn't know how long he ran. Time stopped meaning anything beyond the next breath, the next footfall. The trail descended in switchbacks, but Daniel took them straight, crashing through undergrowth, bouncing off trees, accepting minor impacts to maintain speed. Behind him, always behind him, the sounds of pursuit, not just clicking now, but other things, breaking branches, disturbed earth, and occasionally that voice in his head, fainter with distance, but still present. The hunger spreads, always spreads. Started with one, now many, soon all. Beautiful hunger, perfect hunger. You will understand. Everyone understands eventually. Daniel emerged from the tree line onto the road where his truck waited next to Lauren Weber's Honda. He fumbled his keys, dropped them, retrieved them with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The truck's interior light seemed impossibly bright after the forest's darkness. He started the engine, threw it into reverse, and didn't turn on the headlights until he was a quarter-mile down the road, tires spitting gravel, speedometer pushing limits that would have been reckless on the washed-out surface, but felt necessary now. He didn't slow down until the pavement returned. Even then, he kept checking his mirrors, looking for something tall and wrong-jointed standing in the road behind him. The truck's heating system blasted at full power, but he couldn't get warm. The cold had gotten inside somehow, deeper than skin, settling into his bones. At the ranger station, Tommy Vickers took one look at Daniel and reached for the phone. "What happened? Where's your pack?" Daniel tried to answer. His mouth opened, but the words wouldn't form properly. How could he explain what he'd seen? Who would believe him? His rational mind suggested hypothermia-induced hallucinations, altitude sickness, sleep deprivation, any of a dozen medical explanations that made more sense than the truth. "Lauren Weber," he finally managed. "She's gone. There's something up there." Something? Daniel saw it in Tommy's eyes. Concern for Daniel's mental state, not belief in his report. And why should Tommy believe? Daniel barely believed it himself, and he'd seen it, felt it, heard its hunger inside his head. "We need to close the trail," Daniel said. "Right now. No one goes up there. Dan, you look like hell. Let's get you checked out first, then we can talk about—" "Now!" The word came out louder than intended, sharp with an edge that made Tommy step back. "Close it now, or people will die." Tommy's hand moved to his radio, but whether to call for medical assistance or to actually close the trail, Daniel couldn't tell. It didn't matter. He'd done what he could, warned them, reported it. Now someone else could make sense of this, could figure out how to explain what defied explanation. Daniel walked outside, needing air despite the cold. The parking lot's security light cast everything in harsh white blue, creating shadows with knife-edge precision. He stared back toward the mountains, those dark peaks invisible against the night sky but present anyway. Felt more than seen. His phone buzzed. A text from his girlfriend asking if he'd be home for dinner. Normal life continuing, oblivious to what lurked in the high country. He started to type a response, and that's when he noticed his hands. The tremor had stopped. In fact, his hands were completely steady, perfectly steady. And his knee, which should have been swelling and painful, felt fine, better than fine. He'd torn something, he was sure of it, but now there was no pain at all. And he was hungry. So incredibly hungry. When had he last eaten? This morning? Yesterday? He couldn't remember, and it didn't matter because the hunger was growing, expanding to fill all available space in his awareness. His stomach felt empty, deeply empty, the kind of emptiness that needed to be filled immediately. Daniel walked to his truck and found the emergency granola bars he kept in the glove box. He ate one, then another, then the third one, and the fourth, until the entire box was gone and the hunger hadn't diminished at all. If anything, it had gotten worse, sharper. A physical ache that radiated from his core to his extremities. He looked at his hands again in the truck's dome light. They looked normal. They felt normal. But underneath the skin, something was changing. He could feel it happening. A transformation that wouldn't manifest for days or weeks but had already started, initiated by that moment when the creature had grabbed his pack, when its claws had brushed against his shoulder for just a fraction of a second. The cold followed him home. It settled into his apartment, resistant to the thermostat he cranked to 80 degrees. He ate everything in his refrigerator, leftover pizza, raw vegetables, condiments, things he'd never normally consume. And still the hunger persisted, beautiful and terrible, exactly as Lauren's journal had described it. Daniel understood now. Lauren hadn't been the first. That bone circle suggested others, many others, over years or decades or centuries. The Wendigo, because his analytical mind finally accepted what he was dealing with, what indigenous peoples had warned about in stories passed down through generations, didn't kill. It transformed. It spread. One became many, and the hunger was contagious. He pulled out his laptop and began researching, looking for answers in folklore and anthropology, in accounts dismissed as myth by people who'd never climbed to 5,400 feet in the North Cascades and felt winter arrive in October with predatory intent. The Algonquian peoples had known. They'd had rules, taboos, rituals designed to prevent what happened when humans gave in to consumption, when survival cannibalism opened a door that could never be fully closed. The accounts described physical transformation over weeks, elongation of limbs, hardening of skin, growth of bone protrusions, an appetite that expanded beyond food to encompass everything: fabric, wood, metal, stone, the hunger indiscriminate in its need for more. And the cold, the unnatural cold that followed the transformed wherever they went, winter made manifest in flesh that no longer generated its own heat. Daniel found a photograph in an archived anthropology journal, taken in 1923 by a researcher who dismissed it as a hoax. The image showed something standing at a tree line, tall and emaciated, barely humanoid. In the handwritten notes below, the researcher mentioned the indigenous guides who'd refused to approach, who'd wanted to burn the entire forest to stop what they called the hunger that walks. His phone rang, Tommy's name on the screen. Daniel let it go to voicemail. What could he say? That he'd been infected? That he could feel the transformation beginning, his body temperature dropping degree by degree, his appetite for normal food giving way to something more fundamental? They'd hospitalize him, study him, try to cure what had no cure. Instead, Daniel did what his analytical mind suggested. He documented. He opened a new file on his laptop and began writing everything he remembered. The timeline, the temperature drops, the tracks, Lauren's journal entries, the bone circle, the creature's appearance, the voice in his head. Clinical descriptions of his current symptoms, measurements, data. If he was becoming something else, at least the information would remain. A warning for whoever found it. The hunger grew worse through the night. By dawn, Daniel had consumed everything edible in his apartment and moved on to other things. Cardboard tasted like wood, like forest floor, like the trees where the Wendigo waited. Plastic had a chemical sweetness that numbed his tongue. He tried to stop himself, but the hunger overrode everything. A need so profound that it felt like drowning, like suffocation, like every cell in his body screaming for fuel. In the bathroom mirror, his reflection looked normal, still looked like Daniel Hayes, 32 years old, NPS Ranger with 6 years of service. But his eyes had changed. Even he could see it. The warmth had gone out of them, replaced by something vast and empty. He measured his temperature, 92.3 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. His phone buzzed constantly now. Tommy, his girlfriend, his supervisor. Messages demanding explanations. offering help, expressing concern. Daniel listened to them from a growing distance as if they were speaking to someone else, someone who still existed in the normal world where problems had solutions and mysteries had explanations. He knew what he had to do. The laptop file spelled it out in clear analytical prose. He had perhaps 48 hours before the transformation became irreversible. Maybe less. The research suggested that isolation was crucial. The Wendigo didn't hunt in populated areas. It remained in wilderness, drawn to the cold and high elevations where it could spread without interference. Daniel packed a bag with supplies he wouldn't need: food, water, clothing. His body didn't want these things anymore, but his mind clung to routines, to the idea that he was still human, still capable of planning and rational thought. He drove back toward the mountains, toward the cascades that rose like broken teeth against the morning sky. The temperature in his truck wouldn't rise above 50 degrees despite the heater running full blast. Other drivers gave him strange looks at red lights, and Daniel realized he was breathing clouds in the heated interior, his exhalations visible in air that should have been warm. He parked at a different trailhead, one that led deeper into the wilderness, away from established campsites and popular trails. The sign warned of extreme conditions, unpredictable weather, no cell service beyond this point. Perfect. As Daniel shouldered his pack and started walking, he felt the hunger shift. It was no longer just consuming, it was anticipating. It knew where he was going. It welcomed him. The cold that had been pursuing him reversed direction, now emanating from within, spreading outward to frost the vegetation he brushed against. On a boulder beside the trail, someone had spray painted in faded orange. "Turn back." Below it, older graffiti, barely visible. "Do not feed what walks here." Daniel didn't turn back. He climbed higher, where the air thinned and the trees twisted and the world became sharp-edged and unforgiving. His knee, which should have been injured, felt strong. His breathing, which should have been labored at altitude, came easy. His body was adapting, optimizing for conditions that would kill a normal human. By the time he reached the tree line, Daniel understood that he was no longer trying to escape. He was going home. The hunger had its own geography, its own territory, and it called him to where others like him waited, where Lauren Weber had gone, where countless others had vanished over decades, transformed and added to something older than the mountains themselves. He found them at dusk. They stood in a clearing surrounded by dead trees, a dozen figures in various stages of change. Some still looked almost human. Others had progressed further, bodies elongated and wrong, faces stretched into permanent expressions of need. They didn't speak, not with words, but Daniel heard them anyway, felt their hunger resonating with his own, a chorus of consumption that promised belonging and purpose and an end to loneliness. One stepped forward, and Daniel recognized Lauren Weber in the shape of her skull, in the blue jacket that still clung to her transformed frame in tatters. She reached out with fingers that had grown too long, bones pushing through the tips, and Daniel took her hand. The cold flowed between them, recognition and welcome and terrible understanding. The hunger would never stop. It would grow with each feeding, expand with each new member, spread across the mountains like winter, patient and inevitable. And Daniel, who had spent 6 years reading incident reports and analyzing patterns, finally understood the pattern he'd been part of all along. They hunted together that night, moving through the forest with speed that defied their emaciated appearances, drawn to the warmth of life like moths to flame. They found a late-season camper, someone who'd ignored the warnings, who thought they knew these mountains. Daniel watched himself participate, observed his actions from a detached analytical distance, noting how efficiently the hunger operated, how perfectly it had designed its vectors of transmission. By morning, there were 13, the transformation completed over the following weeks. Daniel's rational mind persisted longer than his humanity, documenting the process even as it happened to him. His final coherent thought, typed into his phone before his fingers grew too long to use the keyboard, was a coordinate: 48, 127 degree N, 121.1784 degree W. A warning, a marker. a place future researchers would find when they finally took the folklore seriously. But no one came. The trail remained open, marked with warnings that hikers ignored. The disappearances continued, spaced far enough apart that patterns were difficult to establish, close enough together that something was clearly wrong. And in the high country of the North Cascades, where winter came early and stayed late, the cold deepened year by year, spreading down from the peaks in ways that meteorologists couldn't explain. Daniel Hayes, who had been Database Dan, who had read every report and analyzed every pattern, had finally become a data point himself. His truck sat in the ranger station parking lot for 3 weeks before being towed. His apartment lease expired, belongings boxed and stored. His girlfriend moved on. His colleagues memorialized him with a plaque and a scholarship fund, and eventually stopped wondering what had happened on Cascade Pass. Only Tommy Vickers, promoted to senior ranger after Daniel's disappearance, sometimes stood in the parking lot at night and looked toward the mountains. He remembered Daniel's wild eyes, his insistence on closing the trail, the terror in his voice. Tommy had closed it for 2 weeks before pressure from management reopened it. Now he carried that decision like a weight, especially when another hiker went missing, or when unexpected cold fronts settled over the high country in the middle of summer, or when the search and rescue teams reported finding campsites abandoned in ways that made no sense. On cold nights when the wind came down from the peaks and made the ranger